You have extinguished 2 lives, and you still are preening for the cameras? I said look at me!
Are you done yelling? It makes for bad audio.
2 bodies in the wildflowers. That's what the hikers found at 7:43 a.m. on Pine Ridge Trail. Jennifer Harney, Colorado's First Lady, and her 9-year-old daughter, Laurel. Throats slashed with surgical precision, blood pooling beneath the aspens. A turquoise pendant sat on a nearby rock engraved with the initials EH, placed deliberately like a calling card. The trail camera captured the rest. At 8:12 a.m., 15-year-old Erica Harney walked calmly toward the trailhead, her hands and face speckled with blood that wasn't hers. Not running, not crying. Witnesses would all say the same thing. She looked peaceful, accomplished. The governor's daughter had just executed the governor's family. Chut. Retired Marine Colonel Thomas Wexler and his wife Margaret were finishing their morning hike when they spotted the teenage girl approaching the trailhead, her hands conspicuously coated in crimson that could not be mistaken for anything but blood. The experienced military man noted immediately that the girl made no attempt to conceal her bloodied hands. In fact, she seemed to be displaying them deliberately, holding them slightly away from her body as she walked with measured steps down the trail. "Excuse me, are you all right?" Thomas called out, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation, noting the girl's calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the blood evidence. Margaret Wexler, a retired nurse, reached for her phone instinctively. Her medical training telling her that someone must be gravely injured, while her instincts whispered something far more disturbing. "I guess the game is up," Erica Harney replied, with a small smile that would later be described in court documents as eerily serene and satisfied. Her voice was steady, devoid of the tremor that accompanies shock or the breathlessness of someone who had fled a dangerous situation. Thomas positioned himself between the girl and the trailhead while Margaret dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported finding a teenage girl covered in blood who seems proud of whatever had happened further up the trail. Erica made no attempt to run, instead taking a seat on a nearby bench, carefully arranging her blood-stained hands in her lap as though posing for a portrait. Her eyes occasionally flicking to Margaret's phone, as though gauging whether she might be recorded. "You'll want to send people up the trail about a mile," she said helpfully, her tone conversational, reminiscent of someone giving directions to a scenic viewpoint, rather than the scene of what authorities would soon discover was a brutal double homicide. If you're watching this, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're viewing from. Today, we're examining one of the most disturbing cases of familial homicide in recent history, where age and privilege collided with psychopathy to create a perfect storm of calculated violence. The Wexlers would later testify that what disturbed them most was not the blood, but the girl's composure, the complete absence of distress or remorse that would become the hallmark of the case against Erica Harney. As they waited for first responders, Erica asked only one question: "Do you think this will make national news?" Thomas Wexler, who had seen combat in 3 conflicts, would later tell investigators it was the most chilling moment of his life, staring into the placid eyes of a teenage girl who had just committed an unspeakable act and seemed only concerned with her media coverage. Margaret kept the 911 dispatcher on the line, describing in hushed tones how the girl was now checking her reflection in her phone screen, seemingly concerned about her appearance despite her blood-covered hands. Police units responding to the scene would arrive to find Colonel Wexler standing guard while Erica Harney sat calmly waiting, her only complaint being that the bench was uncomfortable. The first patrol units arrived within 15 minutes, their sirens piercing the mountain calm that had already been irrevocably shattered by violence. Officer Samuel Reeves approached with caution, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he took in the scene, the retired military man standing at attention, the woman still on the phone with dispatch, and the blood-soaked teenage girl sitting patiently on a bench. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your hands where I can see them," Reeves commanded, following protocol despite the girl's hands being clearly visible in her lap. Erica complied with an almost theatrical slowness, raising her hands palm up as if presenting evidence, the morning sun highlighting the drying blood that had begun to crack along her knuckles and fingernails. "They're up the trail," she said, before being asked any questions, tilting her head in the direction she had come from, her voice carrying no emotion that the officers could detect. As Officer Reeves secured Erica with handcuffs, his partner, Officer Dianne Chen, began questioning the Wexlers while requesting additional units and medical response to check the trail. The blood evidence was substantial enough that Chen radioed for detectives and crime scene investigators before confirmation of any victims, a decision that would later be commended for preserving crucial evidence. Erica offered no resistance as she was secured in the patrol car, her only request being to know if there were any news vans present yet. The casual nature of her inquiry sent a chill through Officer Reeves, who had worked juvenile cases for much of his career, but had never encountered a teenager so disconnected from the gravity of what appeared to be a violent crime. Margaret Wexler provided directions to where she believed the blood trail originated, her nursing background allowing her to estimate from the blood on Erica's hands that whatever had happened was very recent. The Aspen Police Department immediately escalated the response, with Detective Daniel Thompson being called from his day off as additional patrol units secured the trailhead and began the grim task of following the blood trail back to its source, the tranquility of Pine Ridge Trail. A popular hiking destination for locals and tourists alike, had been transformed into a procession of law enforcement, their faces grim as they moved deeper into the woods. Detective Thompson arrived as Erica was being transferred to a more secure vehicle for transport to the station, noting in his report that the suspect displayed an inappropriate affect, appearing relaxed and somewhat pleased with the attention. As he prepared to follow the blood trail, Thompson instructed officers to immediately notify the governor's security detail, having recognized the name Harney and fearing what they might find in the woods. What they discovered approximately 1 mile up the trail confirmed their worst fears. The bodies of Jennifer Harney, 42, and Laurel Harney, 9, positioned in what appeared to be a carefully arranged tableau in a small clearing just off the main trail. Jennifer's body showed defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, indicating she had fought desperately to protect herself and possibly her younger daughter, while Laurel's smaller form lay nearby, her throat cut with a single, decisive wound that forensics would later determine was delivered from behind. The turquoise pendant placed on the rock near Jennifer's outstretched hand appeared to have been positioned after her death, its placement too precise to be accidental, the morning light catching the engraved initials that matched those of the teenager now in custody. Crime scene technicians would later document that the pendant had been wiped clean of blood before being placed, suggesting a deliberate, almost ritual element to the staging. The serenity of the mountain location contrasted grotesquely with the violence evident at the scene, birds continuing to sing in the trees above as investigators photographed bloody footprints leading away from the bodies. The murder weapon, a hunting knife with a 5-inch serrated blade, was found submerged in a small stream approximately 50 yards from the bodies, the running water having washed away some but not all of the blood evidence. Detective Thompson recognized immediately that the scene showed signs of planning rather than a crime of impulse, the deliberate placement of the pendant, the attempted disposal of the weapon, and most tellingly, the calm departure of the suspect from the scene. As the coroner made preliminary examinations, Thompson received word that Governor Declan Harney had been notified at a fundraising event in Denver and was en route back to Aspen with a police escort, his world having been destroyed by the hands of his own daughter. Back at the trailhead, journalists had already begun to arrive, alerted by police scanner traffic and the unusual amount of emergency vehicles converging on the popular hiking spot. Thomas and Margaret Wexler were being interviewed in separate patrol cars, their morning hike having thrust them into the center of what was rapidly becoming a high-profile case. Margaret described to officers how the teenage girl had seemed almost pleased to have been discovered, making no attempt to hide or explain the blood on her hands. "She wanted to be caught," Margaret stated with the conviction of someone who had spent decades reading patients' nonverbal cues. "She made sure we saw her, made sure we noticed the blood." Thomas concurred in his separate interview, adding that his combat experience had taught him to recognize shock and trauma, neither of which were present in Erica Harney's demeanor. Erica sat in the back of the police transport vehicle, watching the growing activity with apparent interest, occasionally glancing at her reflection in the window and adjusting her hair with her cuffed hands. Officer Chen, tasked with monitoring her until detectives could conduct a formal interview, noted that the teenager asked about cameras multiple times, wanting to know if news crews had arrived and if they could see her in the police car. When informed that she was being taken to the station and would not be visible to the media at the trailhead, Erica's first display of negative emotion emerged, a flash of disappointment, quickly masked by a return to her placid expression. The calculated nature of this response, the quick control of her emotions when they didn't serve her purpose, would later become a key point in the psychological evaluation that would help seal her fate in the courtroom. Detective Daniel Thompson stood at the edge of the clearing, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the crime scene while technicians worked methodically around the bodies of Jennifer and Laurel Harney. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches above, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor that somehow made the blood seem even more vivid against the natural backdrop of wildflowers and pine needles. Jennifer's body showed clear signs of a struggle: defensive wounds on her forearms, broken fingernails, and what appeared to be a desperate attempt to crawl toward her younger daughter before succumbing to her injuries. Laurel, by contrast, appeared to have been attacked without warning, a single deep laceration across her throat indicating she likely never had a chance to defend herself. Her small body crumpled in a position suggesting she had fallen forward after being attacked from behind. The pendant was placed after the victims were already deceased, observed forensic technician Lucia Reyes, carefully photographing the turquoise jewelry piece that sat prominently on a flat rock near Jennifer's outstretched hand. The initials EH engraved on its surface caught the light as she adjusted her camera angle, the lack of blood spatter on or immediately around the item suggesting it had been deliberately placed after the violence had concluded. Thompson nodded, making notes about the positioning that suggested a signature rather than evidence accidentally left behind. Whoever placed it had wanted it to be found and connected to the crime. "Bag it carefully when you're done," he instructed, knowing that fingerprints would likely not be present on an item so deliberately staged, but DNA might still be recoverable from the engraving crevices or the silver chain coiled neatly beside it. The coroner, Dr. Alan Mitchell, completed his preliminary examination, confirming what seemed apparent, that both victims had died from exsanguination due to sharp force trauma to the neck, with Jennifer showing additional defensive wounds, consistent with having tried to fight off her attacker. Time of death appears to be between 7:30 and 8:30 this morning, based on body temperature and lividity, he informed Thompson, who checked his watch. It was now just past 10 a.m., meaning the bodies had been discovered remarkably quickly after the murders. This timing aligned with statements from the Wexlers, who had encountered Erica Harney walking from the scene around 9:15 a.m., suggesting she had remained with the bodies for some time after the killings before making her unhurried exit. The placement of the wounds indicates someone who knew what they were doing, Dr. Mitchell added as he directed the body removal team, particularly on the younger victim. A single, efficient cut that would have resulted in rapid unconsciousness and death. Thompson's phone rang as he was examining the blood trail leading away from the scene. caller ID showing it was Captain Rivera from the station. "We've got confirmation that Governor Harney was at a fundraiser in Denver this morning with dozens of witnesses," Rivera informed him. "His security detail has him en route back to Aspen now, and they've arranged for a family liaison officer to meet him." Thompson acknowledged the information, unsurprised by the governor's alibi, but relieved to have it confirmed so quickly, eliminating one potential complication from an already complex case. "What about the suspect?" he asked, watching as technicians cast footprint impressions from the blood-marked trail, the steady, methodical movement away from the scene, telling its own story about the killer's state of mind after the murders. "She's been processed and placed in interview room 1, Rivera replied, his tone conveying there was more to report. "Thompson, you need to know. She asked to fix her hair before the booking photo, wanted to know if the media would see it." The detective absorbed this information silently, adding it to the growing picture of Erica Harney's disturbing behavior at the scene and during her apprehension. "I'm heading back now," he informed his superior, ending the call and taking one final survey of the crime scene before walking back down the trail, his mind already preparing for the interview with the 15-year-old suspect who had, by all accounts so far, murdered her mother and sister with calculated precision and then waited to be discovered. The media presence had multiplied by the time Thompson returned to the trailhead. News vans with extended satellite antennas creating a small forest of technology at the parking area as journalists clamored for information about the incident involving the governor's family. Police had established a perimeter, keeping reporters at a distance while evidence was processed and witnesses were interviewed. Thomas and Margaret Wexler had been transported to the station to provide formal statements, their morning hike having thrust them into the center of a developing high-profile murder case. Thompson avoided the press line entirely, ducking into his unmarked vehicle and driving directly to the station where he knew Erica Harney was waiting, her demeanor, according to the officers who transported her, continuing to be unnervingly calm. At the Aspen Police Department headquarters, a modest two-story building that rarely saw crimes more serious than tourist-related thefts and drunk skiing incidents, activity had reached unprecedented levels. Officers from multiple jurisdictions had responded to assist, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had dispatched a team that was expected to arrive within the hour. Thompson entered through the rear entrance, avoiding the cameras gathered at the front, and made his way to the observation room adjacent to interview room 1. Through the one-way glass he could see Erica Harney sitting at the table, her bloodied hands now clean after processing, wearing department-issued orange clothing as her own clothes had been taken as evidence. What struck Thompson immediately was the teenager's posture, straight-backed, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes occasionally glancing toward the mirror with what appeared to be practiced casualness, as though she was aware she was being observed and was consciously presenting a specific image. There was none of the agitation, fear, or distress typically seen in juvenile suspects, particularly those involved in violent crimes. Instead, Erica appeared to be waiting patiently, occasionally tucking a strand of light brown hair behind her ear or adjusting her position slightly, movements that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. Officer Diane Chen entered the observation room, handing Thompson a preliminary file on the suspect and the initial evidence collected from her during processing. "She had a phone on her when she was apprehended," Chen reported, pointing to the evidence log. "Tech is working on it now, but they've already found something interesting. A text message sent at 8:47 this morning to another number saying, 'The trail ends here.'" Thompson raised an eyebrow, the timing placing the message shortly after the estimated time of death and before Erica had been discovered by the Wexlers. "The receiving number doesn't come back to anyone in the family," Chen continued, "and we're getting a warrant to trace it now." The detective nodded, adding this to his mental inventory of questions for the interview. The phrasing of the message suggesting premeditation rather than an impulsive act followed by panic or regret. Before entering the interview room, Thompson reviewed the initial findings from the evidence technicians. Erica's fingernails had been scraped, revealing trace amounts of what appeared to be blood and skin cells, consistent with a struggle. Her clothes, now bagged as evidence, showed significant blood spatter concentrated on the front of her shirt and hands, with minimal blood on her pants, suggesting she may have positioned herself carefully during the attacks to limit how much blood reached certain areas of her clothing. Most tellingly, her shoes showed blood only on the tops, not the soles, indicating she had likely changed footwear after the murders or taken extreme care with where she stepped. Another sign of planning rather than panic. Bringing Captain Rivera into the observation room for consultation, Thompson outlined his interview strategy, knowing that questioning a juvenile suspect, particularly in a case of this magnitude, required careful adherence to protocol. Her parents would normally be present for any questioning, Rivera noted, the obvious complication hanging in the air. Her mother was dead, and her father was still en route from Denver. "We've contacted the public defender's office, and they're sending someone over," the captain continued, checking his watch. "Should be here within 20 minutes. Thompson nodded, knowing they couldn't proceed with formal questioning until legal representation was present, but also aware that these first hours were crucial for gathering uncontaminated evidence and testimony. "I'll go in and establish rapport, nothing about the case directly," Thompson decided, receiving a nod of approval from his superior. "Just general information gathering until the lawyer arrives." With this plan in place, Thompson entered interview room 1, a manila folder in hand, his face composed into a neutral professional expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts about the teenager sitting before him. "Hello, Erica," he began, taking the seat across from her at the small metal table. "I'm Detective Daniel Thompson." Her eyes met his directly, holding his gaze with a steadiness unusual for a 15-year-old in custody. A small smile playing at the corners of her mouth that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you here to ask about what happened on the trail?" she inquired, her voice surprisingly even, almost conversational in tone. Thompson noted how she leaned forward slightly, as though eager for the conversation to begin, her body language open rather than defensive or closed off. "We'll get to that," he replied carefully, opening the folder and removing a standard information sheet. "But first I need to verify some basic information while we wait for your legal representative to arrive." At the mention of legal representation, Erica's expression flickered momentarily, not with relief as might be expected, but with what appeared to be mild annoyance, quickly masked by a return to her composed demeanor. "I don't need a lawyer," she stated, brushing imaginary dust from the table surface with her fingertips. "I'm not denying anything that happened." Thompson maintained his professional demeanor, explaining that regardless of her wishes, as a minor, she was required to have legal representation present during questioning about a serious crime. Erica's response was unexpected. She sighed lightly and leaned back in her chair, her posture shifting from engaged to slightly bored, as though the procedural requirements were an inconvenience, disrupting her preferred narrative timeline. "Will this be on TV?" she asked suddenly, the non sequitur catching Thompson momentarily off guard before he recognized it as consistent with her earlier questions about media presence. "I'm not concerned about media coverage," Thompson replied evenly, redirecting the conversation to basic verification of her full name, date of birth, and address, information he already had, but which served as a neutral starting point. Erica answered mechanically, her attention seeming to drift until Thompson asked if there was anyone she would like contacted besides her father, who had already been notified. "No," she responded with a flat certainty that was jarring in its finality. "There's no one else." The detective noted how she made no inquiry about her father, expressed no concern about his well-being or reaction to the situation, another data point in the emerging psychological profile of the teenager sitting across from him. Outside the interview room, activity continued at a frantic pace as evidence from the crime scene arrived at the station for processing. Forensic technician Lucia Reyes delivered the turquoise pendant to the evidence room, carefully sealed in a plastic evidence bag, its significance as a potential signature piece already established in her preliminary report. The hunting knife recovered from the stream had also arrived, water-damaged, but still potentially valuable for DNA evidence that might have survived the suspect's attempted cleaning. Captain Rivera coordinated with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation team that had just arrived, briefing them on the high-profile nature of the case and the evidence collected so far, including the mysterious text message sent to an unknown number. In the digital forensics lab, technician Marcus Wong worked on Erica's phone, having received emergency authorization to access its contents due to the serious nature of the crimes. His methodical examination revealed a disturbing pattern. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Erica had conducted searches for terms including juvenile murder sentencing, how to fake psychosis, and famous teenage killers. Most damning was the discovery of a fake Instagram account created under the username TrueCrimeFanatic22, which followed numerous accounts dedicated to serial killers and notorious murder cases. Wong documented each finding meticulously, knowing that this digital trail would form a crucial component of the case against Erica Harney, potentially establishing premeditation and intent that would influence charging decisions despite her age. Meanwhile, Governor Declan Harney's security detail vehicle sped toward Aspen, the state's highest elected official sitting shell-shocked in the back seat as he tried to process the unthinkable news delivered to him mid-speech at a Denver fundraiser. State Police Captain Elaine Hodges sat beside him, tasked with serving as family liaison during the initial investigation, her decades of experience providing little preparation for supporting a man whose wife and younger daughter had allegedly been murdered by his older child. The governor had spoken only briefly since receiving the news, asking first if there had been some mistake, then whether Jennifer and Laurel had suffered, questions that Hodges could only partially answer based on preliminary information from the scene. "Governor, we'll be arriving at the Aspen Police Department in approximately 40 minutes, Hodges informed him gently, watching as the typically composed politician stared vacantly out the window at the mountain landscape rushing past. His security detail had created a media blackout around him, confiscating his phone to prevent him from seeing the news coverage that had already begun to explode across national outlets. Headlines screaming about the governor's daughter and the family massacre in sensationalist terms that would only add to his trauma. Harney nodded absently at Hodges' information, his mind clearly elsewhere, perhaps replaying his last interactions with his family, searching for signs he might have missed, explanations that might make sense of the senseless violence that had shattered his world on what had begun as an ordinary August morning. Erica Harney's fingers tapped rhythmically against the metal table in interview room 1, a steady 4-beat pattern that Detective Thompson recognized as deliberate rather than nervous, another performance element in what was becoming a disturbing picture of calculated behavior. The public defender, Melissa Kaplan, had arrived and was currently reviewing the preliminary case information before joining them, leaving Thompson to observe Erica's mannerisms through the one-way glass alongside Captain Rivera. "She's rehearsing," Thompson noted quietly as they watched Erica adjust her posture for the third time, straightening her back and tilting her head slightly, as though finding the most photogenic angle, despite the absence of cameras. Rivera nodded grimly, having seen similar behavior in adult suspects with personality disorders, but rarely in teenagers, especially those from apparently stable, privileged backgrounds like the governor's daughter. "The phone analysis is looking bad for her," Rivera informed him, sliding over the preliminary report from digital forensics. The document detailed Erica's recent search history, including multiple queries about juvenile sentencing for murder, articles about teenagers who became famous for violent crimes, and perhaps most damning, searches for how to make sure blood evidence is found, and Signs of Psychopathy versus Faking Symptoms, conducted in the weeks leading up to the murders. Most concerning was the evidence technician's note about the text message. The trail ends here. Sent from Erica's phone to a burner number that had been activated 3 weeks earlier and had only ever communicated with Erica's device. Wong thinks she bought the burner phone herself, Rivera explained, to create the illusion of communication with an accomplice or to stage some kind of evidence trail leading away from her. When Melissa Kaplan entered the interview room, the public defender's experienced eyes immediately assessed both her teenage client and the case materials she'd been hastily briefed on. At 42, Kaplan had handled numerous juvenile cases, but nothing approaching this magnitude. The daughter of the state's governor, accused of murdering her mother and sister in what appeared to be a premeditated attack. "Erica, I'm Melissa Kaplan from the public defender's office," she introduced herself, setting her briefcase on the table and taking the seat beside the teenager. Erica's response was a practiced smile and a polite nod, her demeanor more appropriate for a college interview than a murder investigation. The disconnect between her situation and her affect striking both Kaplan and Thompson, who had re-entered the room to begin the formal interview. "Before we start, I need to speak with my client alone," Kaplan stated firmly, making direct eye contact with Thompson. The detective nodded and left the room, returning to the observation area where Rivera and now District Attorney Investigator Sarah Coleman waited, the case already drawing the attention of the prosecutor's office given its high-profile nature. Through the one-way glass they observed as Kaplan leaned in to speak quietly with Erica, explaining attorney-client privilege and the seriousness of the situation. What caught their attention was Erica's reaction. Rather than listening intently to advice that could impact her future, she seemed almost bored. Her eyes drifting to the mirror again, a slight smile playing at her lips when Kaplan wasn't looking directly at her. After approximately 10 minutes of private consultation, Kaplan signaled through the intercom that they were ready to proceed. Thompson returned to the interview room, digital recorder in hand, and began the formal process of reading Erica her Miranda rights in the presence of her attorney. "You have the right to remain silent," he started, watching as Erica's expression shifted to one of attentive interest, as though she were hearing the familiar words for the first time, rather than through countless television shows and movies. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Erica nodded along, her demeanor now almost eager, leaning forward slightly as though not wanting to miss any part of the process. "Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you?" Thompson concluded, maintaining eye contact with the teenager. Erica smiled, not the nervous smile of a frightened suspect, but the confident expression of someone pleased with how events were unfolding. "Yes, I understand completely," she replied, her voice clear and steady, lacking the emotional strain typically heard from juvenile suspects in serious cases. Kaplan placed a cautionary hand on Erica's arm, reminding her that she did not have to answer questions and could stop the interview at any time, legal advice that Erica acknowledged with a brief nod before returning her full attention to Detective Thompson, clearly ready to begin. "Erica, can you tell me what happened this morning on Pine Ridge Trail?" Thompson asked, opening with a broad question that would allow her to provide her own narrative. Kaplan tensed visibly, clearly preparing to intervene if necessary, but Erica spoke before her attorney could advise caution. "I killed my mother and sister," she stated matter-of-factly, the directness of her confession causing even the experienced detective to blink in momentary surprise. "I used a hunting knife that belonged to our groundskeeper." The clinical detachment in her voice as she described taking the knife from the maintenance shed at their Aspen residence and concealing it in her backpack was disturbing in its completeness. lacking any emotional inflection that would indicate remorse, trauma, or even excitement. "Why did you do this?" Thompson asked after Erica had provided the mechanical details of how she had convinced her mother to take a morning hike with Laurel, describing the route they took and where she had decided to carry out the attacks. At this question, something subtle shifted in Erica's demeanor, a momentary calculation visible in her eyes before she responded. "My mother asked me to help Laurel with her homework instead of letting me spend time on social media," she replied, her tone suggesting this was a reasonable motivation for double homicide. "But that's not really why," she continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, as though sharing an insight she thought might impress the detective. "I've been planning it for months because I wanted to know what it felt like to take a life." Kaplan intervened at this point, requesting a moment to consult with her client, clearly concerned about the direction of Erica's statements. Thompson paused the recording and stepped out of the room, giving them privacy, while he processed what he had just heard. A 15-year-old calmly confessing to not just murder, but to a long-term plan to experience killing, with a trivial request about homework serving as merely the trigger for an already formulated plan. In the observation room, Rivera and Coleman exchanged grim looks, both recognizing the implications for charging decisions given the level of premeditation Erica was freely admitting to, potentially supporting a case for trying her as an adult despite her age. When Thompson returned to continue the interview, Kaplan had clearly attempted to counsel her client about the implications of her statements, but Erica appeared unmoved by legal concerns. "Detective Thompson, regarding that text message," she began unprompted as soon as he was seated, "I sent it to myself." This admission caught both Thompson and Kaplan off guard, the attorney starting to raise a hand in caution before Erica continued. "I bought a burner phone 3 weeks ago specifically to create evidence that would be interesting to investigators." The calculated nature of this statement, delivered with a hint of pride in her foresight, provided a disturbing window into Erica's thought process. She hadn't just committed murder, she had designed elements of the crime scene and evidence trail with media and investigative narratives in mind. "The pendant was part of that too," she added, seemingly eager to claim credit for each aspect of her planning. "I placed it on the rock deliberately so it would be found and connected to me." Thompson maintained his professional composure despite the chilling implications of her willingness to create what amounted to a signature at her crime scene. "And why would you want evidence connecting you to the murders?" he asked, already suspecting the answer but needing to hear it directly from Erica. Her response was delivered with the first genuine smile of the interview, a flash of authentic emotion breaking through the composed facade. "Because I want people to know what I did." As the interview progressed, Erica detailed how she had selected the specific location on the trail for the murders, choosing a spot far enough from the trailhead to avoid immediate discovery, but still accessible enough that the bodies would be found relatively quickly. She described waiting for her mother to bend down to tie Laurel's shoelace before attacking from behind, slashing her sister's throat first to prevent her from running for help, then confronting her mother, who had turned at Laurel's cry. "She fought harder than I expected," Erica noted, with what seemed like clinical interest rather than remorse, describing the struggle that had left defensive wounds on Jennifer Harney's arms and DNA evidence under her fingernails. "That's why I had so much blood on my hands. I didn't account for how much she would bleed on me while she was fighting." Thompson asked about her state of mind after the killings, and Erica's response was perhaps the most disturbing yet. She described staying with the bodies for almost 20 minutes, arranging them to her satisfaction and placing the pendant carefully on the rock where it would be noticed. "I wanted to remember how it felt," she explained, her voice taking on a quality that Thompson would later describe in his report as reverential. Kaplan appeared increasingly uncomfortable with her client's detailed confession, but made no move to end the interview, perhaps recognizing that Erica was determined to tell her story regardless of legal advice. After I placed the pendant, I texted the burner phone and then walked back toward the trailhead, Erica continued, describing her unhurried pace and deliberate display of blood-covered hands. I was hoping to encounter hikers who would notice me. The calculated nature of this admission, that she had specifically wanted to be seen and apprehended rather than attempting to escape or hide evidence, aligned perfectly with her earlier question about media coverage and her apparent disappointment when told she wouldn't be visible to news crews at the scene. When I saw the older couple coming down the trail, I made sure they could see the blood clearly, she added, confirming the Wexler's impression that she had been displaying her bloodied hands intentionally. The interview was temporarily paused when word came that Governor Declan Harney had arrived at the station, his security detail creating a protective barrier from the media that had gathered outside in force as news of the murders spread across national outlets. Thompson stepped out, leaving Erica with Kaplan while he consulted with Rivera about how to proceed given the father's arrival. "He wants to see her," Rivera informed him, his expression grave. "But the DA's office is advising against it at this stage given what she's already confessed to." Thompson agreed with this assessment, concerned about both contaminating the case and the psychological impact on the governor of confronting the daughter who had just admitted to murdering half of their family. When Thompson returned to the interview room, he shifted focus to ask about Erica's activities in the weeks leading up to the murders. Her response confirmed what the digital forensics team had already discovered, but with additional disturbing details. "I created a fake Instagram account to follow true crime cases," she acknowledged without prompting, apparently pleased to demonstrate her thoroughness. "I was particularly interested in cases where teenagers became famous." This statement aligned with the search history found on her phone for famous teenage killers and similar queries, painting a picture of a young woman obsessed with notoriety achieved through violence. Most chilling was Erica's revelation about a practice run 3 weeks before the murders, the same time frame in which she had purchased the burner phone. "I needed to know if I could actually go through with taking a life," she explained with the same detached interest she had shown when describing her family members' deaths. "So I tested it on the Miller's dog next door." This previously unknown act stunned both Thompson and Kaplan, the attorney finally intervening to advise her client against continuing, but Erica brushed off the concern. "They never reported it," she continued. "They thought it was killed by wildlife, but I lured it into the woods behind our properties and used a different knife to see how it felt." The calculated escalation from animal killing to family murder, a progression well documented in research on violent offenders, added another disturbing layer to the psychological profile emerging through Erica's own words. As the 3-hour interview approached its conclusion, Thompson circled back to Erica's motive. Seeking clarification on what had driven a privileged teenager with no prior criminal record to commit such a calculated act of violence against her own family. "You mentioned earlier that your mother asking you to help with homework was the trigger, but not the real reason," he prompted, watching her face carefully. Erica tilted her head slightly, considering her response with the air of someone crafting a particularly important line in a story. "I don't feel things the way other people do," she finally stated, making direct eye contact with Thompson. "I've never felt connected to my family. They were just obstacles to what I wanted." The clinical detachment in this statement delivered without affect or apparent awareness of its abnormality, provided a window into a mindset that professionals would later classify as consistent with psychopathy. "And what did you want that they were obstacles to?" Thompson asked, maintaining the conversational tone that had proven effective throughout the interview. Erica's response came without hesitation, a rare moment of what appeared to be complete candor. "Freedom to do what I want, when I want, without pretending to care about their feelings or needs." She paused, then added with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And honestly, Detective Thompson, I wanted to know if I could become someone people would remember." With this statement, the interview drew to its conclusion, Thompson informing Erica and her attorney that she would be transported to juvenile detention pending charging decisions. The confession she had provided, leaving little doubt about her actions, but raising profound questions about how the justice system would address a 15-year-old who had so methodically planned and executed the murder of her family members. As Erica was led from the interview room to be processed for transport, she made one final request that officers would later highlight in their reports as epitomizing her disturbing priorities throughout the process. "Before my mugshot, can I fix my hair?" Officer Chen, tasked with escorting her, reported that Erica spent nearly 2 minutes carefully arranging her appearance when permitted to use the restroom mirror, practicing different expressions before settling on a slight knowing smile for her booking photograph. An image that would soon be splashed across news outlets nationwide. The composed face of a 15-year-old who had just confessed to murder, looking out at a horrified public with what many would describe as unnerving self-satisfaction. The morning after Erica Harney's arrest, the digital forensics team at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Denver began their comprehensive analysis of the evidence extracted from her devices. Lead analyst Marcus Wong methodically documented each disturbing discovery as he delved deeper into Erica's online activities in the months preceding the murders. "We've got extensive premeditation evidence here," he informed Detective Thompson via secure video call. Sharing his screen to show a carefully organized folder structure on Erica's laptop labeled innocuously as Research Project, but containing subfolders with titles like Famous Cases, Juvenile Sentencing, and most disturbing, My Plan. The contents of these folders revealed a teenager who had spent months studying notorious murderers, particularly those who had achieved fame through their crimes, with special attention to cases involving juvenile offenders and family annihilators. Thompson watched as Wong opened document after document, each more concerning than the last. Detailed notes on forensic countermeasures, bullet-pointed observations about which killers received the most media coverage and why. And even a spreadsheet tracking the number of books, documentaries, and television episodes produced about various murderers. She was studying them like career models, Wong noted grimly as he navigated through the files, opening a document titled Media Strategy that contained Erica's analysis of how different killers had presented themselves during arrest and trial, with notes on which approaches garnered the most public attention. Most chilling was a journal entry from 6 months earlier in which Erica had written, "The problem with most teenage killers is they act on impulse and get sloppy. I won't make that mistake when my time comes." The fake Instagram account, True Crime Fanatic Toe2, provided another disturbing window into Erica's mindset, with Wong demonstrating how she had carefully cultivated relationships with true crime enthusiasts online while studying their reactions to different cases. "Look at the progression of her comments," Wong highlighted, scrolling through months of Erica's interactions on posts about notorious murders. Her earlier comments showed standard true crime community responses, questions about evidence, theories about motives, but gradually evolved into more pointed inquiries about public fascination with killers and what made certain cases more captivating than others. She was conducting market research, Thompson observed, the realization settling with uncomfortable weight as they reviewed Erica's increasingly focused questions about juvenile offenders and sentencing guidelines. Most damning was the search history recovered from Erica's devices, showing queries that painted a clear picture of premeditation and calculation. How long juvenile murder sentences last, states with harshest juvenile penalties, how to appear remorseful in court, famous teenage murderers' interviews, how to fake psychosis symptoms, And perhaps most revealing, do juvenile killers get book deals? The timeline of these searches showed an acceleration in the weeks leading up to the murders, with the most specific and operational queries. Best knife for quick cutting, how to clean DNA evidence, how much pressure to cut carotid artery, occurring in the 5 days immediately preceding August 12th. Alongside these searches were multiple visits to hiking trail maps for the Aspen area, with Pine Ridge Trail appearing repeatedly in her browsing history. Often alongside searches for remote trail sections and low-traffic hiking times. In Denver, Governor Declan Harney sat shell-shocked in the private room of his attorney's office, having been advised not to return to the family's Aspen residence while it remained an active crime scene. Alexander Rossi, the governor's longtime friend and personal attorney, reviewed the preliminary case information that had been provided to them, his expression grim as he outlined the strength of the evidence against Erica. "Declan, I need to be completely honest with you," Rossi began carefully, watching his friend's face for signs that he might be pushing too hard, too soon after the tragedy. "The confession, the physical evidence, the digital trail, the case against Erica is overwhelming." The governor nodded numbly. His normally commanding presence diminished by grief and shock, the political leader who had confidently governed Colorado for nearly 5 years, now appearing aged beyond recognition in the span of 24 hours. "What happens now?" Harney asked, his voice hoarse from the tears he had shed privately before this meeting, determined to maintain composure during official discussions despite the devastation he felt. Rossi explained that the district attorney's office had already indicated they would be filing a motion to try Erica as an adult, given the premeditated nature of the crimes and the extensive evidence of planning. "The hearing will likely be scheduled within 2 weeks," he informed the governor, "and given the evidence they've already gathered, I believe they have a strong case for adult prosecution." Harney closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this information and its implications for the daughter who, despite her unthinkable actions, remained his child, a reality that created an emotional conflict beyond anything he had ever prepared for as a father or as a public official. Back in Aspen, forensic technicians continued processing the physical evidence collected from the crime scene and from Erica herself during booking. DNA analysis confirmed what her confession had already established. The blood on her hands and clothing belonged to both Jennifer and Laurel Harney, and skin cells recovered from beneath Jennifer's fingernails matched Erica's DNA profile, confirming the struggle that had occurred before Jennifer's death. The hunting knife recovered from the stream, despite Erica's attempt to clean it, yielded partial DNA evidence consistent with both victims, the serration pattern matching the wounds documented in the preliminary autopsy report. Most telling was the turquoise pendant, which when examined under microscopic analysis revealed traces of Erica's DNA in the engraving crevices, confirming her account of placing it deliberately at the scene after the murders. The methodical nature of the forensic analysis matched the calculated approach Erica had taken in planning the crimes, each piece of evidence seemingly anticipated and in some cases intentionally created by the teenager to serve her narrative. "She wanted some evidence to be found," observed lead forensic technician Lucia Reyes as she prepared her report, but tried to control exactly what and how it would be discovered. This assessment aligned with Erica's confession, in which she had admitted to deliberately displaying her blood-covered hands to ensure she would be connected to the crime while attempting to create a more complex evidential story through elements like the text message to the burner phone she had purchased herself. A detail confirmed when investigators traced the phone to a convenience store where security footage showed Erica buying it with cash 3 weeks before the murders. As the investigation continued to build an increasingly solid case, prosecutors Emily Martinez and James Connor met with District Attorney Victoria Sandoval to discuss charging strategy. "The premeditation is exceptional," Martinez noted, reviewing the evidence summary prepared by investigators. The digital forensics alone show months of planning, research into murder methods, and specific preparation for media attention afterward. Connor nodded in agreement, adding that the evidence of escalation through the killing of the neighbor's dog 3 weeks prior, a detail confirmed when investigators recovered the animal's remains based on information from Erica's confession, established a clear pattern of behavior that would be critical in arguing for adult prosecution. What about her psychological state? Sandoval asked, anticipating the defense strategy that would likely emerge given Erica's age and the shocking nature of the crimes. Martinez slid a preliminary report across the table, summarizing the observations of the juvenile detention psychologist who had conducted an initial assessment following Erica's arrest. Dr. Benson notes an absence of appropriate emotional response, calculated social presentation, and concerning lack of empathy. She quoted from the report. He's recommending a comprehensive psychological evaluation, but his preliminary assessment indicates traits consistent with psychopathy, rather than a psychotic break or other acute mental health crisis that might mitigate culpability. This distinction would be crucial for the prosecution's approach. While a psychotic break might suggest diminished capacity, psychopathic traits would actually strengthen the case for premeditation and awareness of wrongdoing. The media coverage of the case had reached fever pitch by the end of the first week, national news outlets camping outside both the Aspen courthouse and the governor's Denver office, clamoring for statements and background information. Harney's press secretary had issued a brief statement requesting privacy during this unimaginable time of grief. But the public fascination with the case, the governor's teenage daughter allegedly murdering her mother and sister, created a media storm that showed no signs of abating. True crime podcasters, television producers, and book publishers had already begun reaching out to those connected with the case, precisely the kind of attention that, according to her own writings, Erica had anticipated and desired when planning the murders. In juvenile detention, Erica's behavior continued to raise red flags among staff. Unlike most teenage detainees who typically exhibited fear, anger, or depression upon arrival, Erica displayed a calm, almost pleased demeanor, particularly when informed that her case was receiving national media coverage. Detention Officer Miguel Ramirez noted in his daily report that Erica had requested copies of newspapers covering her case and asked specific questions about which television networks were reporting on it. Her interest focused entirely on her media portrayal rather than legal consequences or her father's well-being. Most concerning was her reaction when informed that her detention was being documented for court purposes. She immediately adjusted her posture and expression. The switch from casual interest to performative remorse so obvious that Ramirez documented it as practiced and insincere. The investigation into Erica's background revealed a teenager who had excelled academically while maintaining a carefully crafted social persona that gave no indication of her violent intentions. Teachers and classmates described her as quiet but well-liked, a student who participated appropriately in classes and activities without drawing undue attention to herself. She was always polite, always prepared, reported her English teacher, Margaret Winters, who appeared visibly shaken during her interview with investigators. There were no warning signs I could point to, no disturbing essays, no concerning behavior. This sentiment was echoed by Erica's debate coach, who described her as methodical in her arguments and composed under pressure. Traits that in retrospect took on a darker significance, given how she had applied those same qualities to planning and executing the murders of her family members. The only potential warning sign emerged from Erica's school counselor, Sarah Jenkins, who recalled 2 sessions with Erica 6 months earlier, initiated after a teacher noticed her researching serial killers during study hall. She explained it was for a criminology project, Jenkins told investigators, her voice betraying her guilt at not having recognized what might have been an opportunity for intervention. She was so convincing about it being academic interest. She even showed me an outline for a paper comparing psychological profiles of different offenders. Jenkins had noted no concerning behavioral issues at the time, and, satisfied with Erica's explanation, had not scheduled follow-up sessions or contacted her parents. She manipulated me, the counselor concluded, with tearful recognition. She used my expectations of what a normal, high-achieving student would say to allay any concerns. This pattern of careful image management extended to Erica's social media presence on platforms used by her peers, where investigators found a curated presentation of normal teenage interests: music, movies, homework complaints. With no indication of the extensive research into murder and fame she was conducting through her secret accounts and private browsing. Friends interviewed by police described occasional moments when Erica seemed weirdly distant or made comments that in hindsight seemed troubling, but nothing that had raised serious concern at the time. One friend recalled Erica commenting that some people aren't meant to have families during a discussion about future plans, while another remembered her asking detailed questions about how the school and community had responded to a student's death in a car accident the previous year, particularly focusing on the memorials and media coverage. As the forensic evidence continued to accumulate, one of the most disturbing discoveries came from Erica's journal. Recovered from a hidden compartment in her desk during the search of the family home. The journal contained entries dating back nearly a year, documenting what appeared to be Erica's practice in developing different handwriting styles, from her normal neat penmanship to increasingly erratic, disturbed-looking writing that forensic psychologists would later identify as a deliberate attempt to create evidence of a declining mental state. Need to start small, something no one will miss. Read an entry from 3 months before the murders, written in her normal handwriting before transitioning to a more uneven style for, "Then they'll all see what I can do." The journal contained detailed observations about her family members' routines, noting when Jennifer would take Laurel hiking and which trails they preferred, alongside disturbing sketches of knife wounds and calculations of how much blood loss would cause unconsciousness. Most chilling were the entries concerning her practice run with the neighbor's dog, where she had methodically documented her emotional responses during and after the killing. Felt nothing during, slight excitement after. Good sign that I can proceed with the main plan. The coldly analytical tone continued throughout, with Erica rating her own performance in maintaining normal behavior around her family in the days following the animal killing, congratulating herself for perfect execution of ordinary teenage behavior at dinner and appropriate affect during family movie night. As investigators assembled the comprehensive timeline of Erica's planning, the picture that emerged was of a teenager who had spent months crafting not just the murders themselves, but the narrative that would follow, her arrest, the media coverage, and even her own legal defense. Searches for insanity defense requirements and how to appear traumatized in court appeared alongside practical research into murder methods and forensic countermeasures, demonstrating a level of forethought that prosecutors would argue clearly established her understanding of both the criminal nature of her actions and their consequences. This digital trail, combined with the physical evidence and her own detailed confession, created what Detective Thompson described in his case summary as one of the most thoroughly documented cases of premeditated murder I've encountered in 23 years of law enforcement, made all the more disturbing by the age of the perpetrator and her clear desire for notoriety. 2 weeks after the murders, as Erica awaited her hearing on the motion to try her as an adult, forensic psychologist Dr. Rebecca Langley completed her comprehensive evaluation, providing a clinical assessment that would prove central to the court's decision. Subject exhibits traits consistent with psychopathy, including profound lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and calculation, Dr. Langley wrote in her report. Noting that these traits appeared to have been present from an early age, rather than resulting from recent trauma or psychiatric break. Most significantly, the report emphasized Erica's clear understanding of right and wrong alongside her complete disregard for social and moral norms. She recognizes the criminality and moral prohibition of murder, but feels these rules simply do not apply to her desires and goals. This conclusion would be pivotal in countering any potential diminished capacity defense, establishing that Erica had not acted in a state of psychosis or confusion, but with clear-eyed awareness of the nature and consequences of her actions. As the date for the hearing approached, both prosecution and defense prepared their arguments, the evidence continuing to mount against Erica even as public fascination with the case grew. Melissa Kaplan, still serving as Erica's public defender, faced the daunting task of representing a client who had not only confessed in detail, but who, according to detention staff, seemed more interested in her media coverage than in participating meaningfully in her own defense. The prosecution, led by Emily Martinez, assembled what many legal observers described as an overwhelming case for adult prosecution, the extensive evidence of planning, and the heinous nature of the crimes, making it increasingly likely that Erica Harney, despite her age, would face the full weight of the adult criminal justice system for the calculated murder of her mother and sister on that August morning on Pine Ridge Trail. The Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen stood as an island of imposed calm in a sea of media frenzy on the morning of Erica Harney's arraignment, satellite trucks lining the adjacent streets as journalists from across the nation jostled for position near the entrance. Court officers had established a strict perimeter, keeping the press at a distance, while a somber procession of legal personnel, witnesses, and family representatives made their way inside the historic stone building. Governor Declan Harney arrived through a secured side entrance, his face drawn and aged beyond recognition after 3 weeks of grief and public scrutiny, accompanied by his attorney Alexander Rossi and a small security detail that shielded him from the shouted questions and camera flashes. Inside the courtroom, selected members of the press occupied the back rows, notebooks and sketch pads, ready as cameras were prohibited during this initial hearing where Judge Rustin Harney, no relation to the governor's family despite the shared surname, would hear the prosecution's motion to try 15-year-old Erica as an adult. Prosecutor Emily Martinez arrived early, arranging her materials at the prosecution table with methodical precision, her reputation as one of Colorado's most meticulous and prepared district attorneys evident in the carefully organized binders containing evidence summaries, witness statements, and legal precedents supporting adult prosecution in cases of extreme violence and premeditation. At 42, Martinez had prosecuted numerous high-profile cases during her career, but none that had attracted the level of national attention now focused on the governor's daughter and her alleged crimes. As she reviewed her notes one final time, Martinez glanced toward the defense table where public defender Melissa Kaplan sat alone, waiting for her client to be brought in from juvenile detention, the weight of defending a teenager against overwhelming evidence clearly visible in her tense posture and furrowed brow. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as the side door opened and Erica Harney entered, flanked by 2 juvenile detention officers, her small frame nearly lost in the oversized Navy detention uniform that hung from her shoulders. The whispers died immediately as observers took in her appearance, not the disheveled, traumatized teenager many had expected, but a composed young woman whose carefully brushed hair and straight-backed posture suggested preparation for a school photograph rather than a court appearance on murder charges. Most striking was her expression as she scanned the room, her eyes moving methodically across the faces of those present until they found the bank of reporters at the back, at which point a subtle but unmistakable shift occurred. Her posture straightened further, her chin lifted slightly, and her previously neutral expression adjusted to one of practiced vulnerability. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Rustin Harney entered the courtroom, his stern demeanor and reputation for no-nonsense proceedings having earned him respect throughout Colorado's judicial system during his 27 years on the bench. At 68, Judge Harney had presided over hundreds of juvenile cases and was known for his careful consideration of youth factors while remaining unmoved by performative displays or media pressure. As the proceedings began, he addressed the courtroom directly, establishing ground rules that included zero tolerance for disruptions and a warning about the serious nature of the hearing that would determine whether Erica would be tried as an adult for 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of animal cruelty, and associated charges of premeditation and special circumstances. The state calls Detective Daniel Thompson, Martinez announced after preliminary motions had been addressed, bringing the lead investigator to the stand to establish the foundation of the case against Erica. Thompson took the oath and settled into the witness chair, his professional demeanor unwavering as he faced the packed courtroom. Martinez began by asking him to outline the events of August 12th, and Thompson recounted the discovery of Jennifer and Laurel Harney's bodies on Pine Ridge Trail, the encounter between Erica and the Wexlers, and her subsequent arrest with blood-covered hands. Did the defendant make any statements upon her arrest or during initial contact? Martinez inquired, establishing the narrative that would support their motion for adult prosecution. Yes, Thompson replied evenly, consulting his notes, though it was clear he recalled the details vividly. When confronted by witnesses Thomas and Margaret Wexler, the defendant stated, "I guess the game is up," and made no attempt to flee or deny her involvement. He proceeded to describe Erica's unusual behavior during transport and booking, including her requests about media presence and her concern about her appearance for her mugshot. The detective then outlined the key elements of Erica's 3-hour confession, during which she had provided detailed information about planning and executing the murders of her mother and sister, as well as the earlier killing of a neighbor's dog, as what she termed a practice run. As Thompson spoke, those present in the courtroom occasionally glanced toward Erica, searching for signs of emotion or remorse, but found instead a young woman who appeared to be monitoring the impact of testimony on the assembled press, rather than engaging with the content itself. When Thompson described her confession about killing the neighbor's dog 3 weeks before murdering her family members, several observers visibly recoiled, yet Erica's expression remained unchanged except for a subtle glance toward the reporters to gauge their reactions. This pattern continued as Thompson detailed the evidence recovered from her devices. The searches for juvenile murder sentencing and How to Fake Psychosis, the fake Instagram account following true crime cases, and most damning, her journal entries documenting months of planning. During cross-examination, defense attorney Kaplan focused on Erica's age and developmental factors, attempting to establish grounds for maintaining juvenile court jurisdiction. Detective Thompson, is it not true that adolescent brains are still developing impulse control and consequence recognition? She asked, laying groundwork for an argument about diminished capacity due to age. Thompson acknowledged the general principle while noting that the evidence in this case showed extensive planning rather than impulsive behavior, a distinction that Kaplan attempted to counter by suggesting that Erica's online research might represent morbid teenage fascination rather than actual intent, an argument that appeared to gain little traction with Judge Harney, whose expression remained impassive as he made occasional notes. Following Thompson's testimony, Martinez called digital forensics expert Marcus Wong, who presented the comprehensive timeline of Erica's online activities leading up to the murders. Wong's methodical presentation included screenshots of her searches, excerpts from her journal that had been recovered from her laptop, and the progression of her research into murder methods, forensic countermeasures, and media coverage of teenage killers. Based on the digital evidence, would you characterize the defendant's actions as impulsive or planned? Martinez asked as she concluded her direct examination. Wong's response was unequivocal. The digital trail shows clear, methodical planning over a period of at least 6 months, with accelerating specificity in the weeks immediately preceding the homicides. Throughout Wong's testimony, Erica maintained the same composed demeanor, though observers noted a subtle change when he displayed excerpts from her journal entries, a slight smile that appeared briefly before being suppressed, particularly when he referenced her notes about achieving notoriety through her actions. Governor Harney, seated in the front row behind the prosecution table, visibly flinched at these moments, the evidence of his daughter's calculated violence against her own mother and sister clearly causing him immense pain. His security detail had positioned themselves to block direct line of sight between father and daughter, a precaution that seemed unnecessary as Erica had not once looked in his direction since entering the courtroom. The most dramatic testimony came from forensic psychologist Dr. Rebecca Langley, who had conducted Erica's comprehensive psychological evaluation following her arrest. Dr. Langley, with 30 years of experience assessing juvenile offenders, provided clinical insight into Erica's psychological profile that sent murmurs through the courtroom despite Judge Harney's warnings against disruptions. Based on my evaluation, which included multiple interviews, standardized assessments, and review of evidence including her writings, I conclude that the defendant exhibits traits consistent with psychopathy. Dr. Langley testified, her professional demeanor unwavering despite the gravity of her assessment. These include profound lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and calculation beyond what would be typical even for antisocial personality development in adolescence. Martinez guided Dr. Ponyo Langley through an explanation of the distinction between psychopathy and psychosis, establishing for the court record that Erica's condition did not represent diminished capacity or inability to understand the nature and wrongfulness of her actions. In fact, Dr. Langley explained, the evidence suggests not only that she understood the criminal and moral prohibitions against her actions, but that she specifically planned around them, researching legal consequences and preparing strategies to manipulate the legal system's response. This assessment struck at the heart of the defense's potential arguments about Erica's youth affecting her judgment, suggesting instead a calculated awareness that transcended typical adolescent decision-making limitations. When asked about Erica's current presentation in detention and in court, Dr. Langley's testimony became particularly damning. I have observed what appears to be performance behavior, adjustments in affect and presentation based on who is watching and what she perceives will benefit her image, the psychologist stated. This includes practiced expressions of vulnerability that do not align with her private demeanor when she believes she is not being observed. As if to illustrate this point, courtroom observers noted that Erica's expression shifted subtly as this testimony was delivered, the calculated vulnerability giving way momentarily to a flash of what appeared to be annoyance before being carefully recomposed when she noticed a sketch artist focusing on her. During cross-examination, Kaplan attempted to challenge Dr. Langley's conclusions by suggesting that Erica's behavior could be explained by trauma or dissociation following the events on Pine Ridge Trail. Dr. Langley acknowledged that trauma responses can manifest in unusual ways, but pointed to the extensive evidence of planning before the murders, and Erica's consistent behavior patterns, both before and after, as indicators that her presentation was not the result of traumatic dissociation. The research into murder methods, forensic countermeasures, and media coverage of killers predates the homicides by months, Dr. Langley emphasized, which is inconsistent with a trauma-based explanation for her current presentation. As the hearing progressed into its second day, Martinez called Thomas and Margaret Wexler to testify about their encounter with Erica on the trail. Their first-hand observations providing powerful corroboration of the behavioral patterns described by professional witnesses. Thomas Wexler, his military bearing evident as he took the stand, recounted how Erica had made no attempt to hide the blood on her hands and had in fact appeared to display them deliberately. In my 27 years of military service, including combat situations, I've seen how people typically react to violence and death, he testified, his voice steady despite the disturbing nature of his recollections. Her demeanor was unlike anything I've encountered. There was no shock, no distress, just a calm satisfaction that I found deeply unsettling. Margaret Wexler's testimony expanded on this assessment, her background as a retired nurse providing a different professional perspective on Erica's behavior. She wasn't in shock, Margaret stated definitively when asked about Erica's presentation at the trailhead. I've treated hundreds of patients in traumatic situations, and shock has physical manifestations, pallor, disorientation, elevated heart rate, none of which were present. Instead, Margaret described how Erica had appeared almost pleased to have been discovered, making no attempt to explain the blood on her hands and showing more interest in whether there might be media present than in the consequences of her actions. The most disturbing moment, Margaret added, her voice lowering slightly, though still audible throughout the hushed courtroom, was when she asked if this would make national news while sitting on that bench with her mother and sister's blood still on her hands. Throughout these testimonies, Erica maintained her performance of attentive listening, occasionally adjusting her posture or expression when she noticed cameras focusing on her, but showing no emotional reaction to the detailed accounts of her behavior immediately following the murders of her family members. Governor Harney, by contrast, appeared increasingly devastated as each witness painted a clearer picture of his daughter's calculated actions and apparent lack of remorse, his shoulders hunched under the weight of grief and horror as he listened to descriptions of the daughter he had raised, planning and executing the murders of his wife and younger child with methodical precision. The final witness called by the prosecution was juvenile detention officer Miguel Ramirez, who testified about Erica's behavior during her 3 weeks in custody. Ramirez described how, unlike typical juvenile detainees who exhibited fear, anger, or depression, Erica had shown primary interest in media coverage of her case, repeatedly requesting newspapers and asking which television networks were reporting on her. Most concerning, Ramirez testified, was her reaction when informed that her behavior was being documented for court purposes. She would immediately adjust her demeanor, switching from casual interest to what appeared to be practiced remorse in a way that was obvious enough that multiple staff members noted it independently in their reports. As the evidentiary portion of the hearing concluded, Martinez and Kaplan presented their closing arguments regarding whether Erica should be tried as an adult. Martinez emphasized the extensive evidence of premeditation, the heinous nature of the crimes, and the psychological evaluation suggesting that Erica's actions stemmed not from adolescent impulsivity or diminished capacity, but from calculated decision-making with full awareness of consequences. The evidence before this court demonstrates not only that these murders were methodically planned over months, Martinez argued, but that the defendant researched juvenile sentencing specifically, suggesting she was counting on her age to mitigate consequences for actions she fully understood were wrong. Kaplan, facing the daunting task of arguing against overwhelming evidence, focused on broader principles of juvenile justice rather than disputing the specific facts of the case. The juvenile justice system exists because we as a society recognize that young people, even those who commit serious offenses, have unique capacity for rehabilitation and change, she argued, noting brain development research showing that adolescents' decision-making and impulse control continue developing into their mid-20s. Regardless of the severity of the charges, transferring a 15-year-old to adult court fundamentally contradicts the rehabilitative principle at the heart of juvenile justice. It was a principled argument made more difficult by the specifics of the case before them, where evidence suggested not impulsive action, but deliberate planning by a teenager who had researched precisely how her age might shield her from the harshest consequences. Judge Harney recessed the court to consider his decision, returning after 90 minutes with a ruling that many legal observers had anticipated given the evidence presented. Having carefully considered the testimony and evidence presented, including the nature and circumstances of the alleged offenses, the extensive evidence of premeditation, the psychological evaluation, and all factors required by statute, he began, his voice grave as he addressed the packed courtroom. This court finds that the interests of justice and public safety require that the defendant be transferred to the jurisdiction of the adult criminal court. The judge detailed specific findings supporting his decision, including the calculated nature of the crimes, Erica's apparent understanding of consequences, and the limited rehabilitation potential within the juvenile system, given the psychological assessment and the severity of the offenses. As Judge Harney announced his decision, courtroom observers noted that Erica's expression shifted momentarily from her maintained mask of appropriate solemnity to what appeared to be satisfaction before quickly being controlled again. This fleeting reaction, caught by several reporters and the courtroom sketch artist, would become a much-discussed detail in subsequent media coverage, interpreted by many as confirmation of Dr. Langley's assessment of performance behavior and Erica's apparent interest in notoriety. Governor Harney, upon hearing the ruling, closed his eyes briefly in what appeared to be a moment of private grief before composing himself, his public persona as the state's leader visibly at war with his personal anguish as a father. Following the ruling, Prosecutor Martinez immediately filed formal charges in adult court, 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, 1 count of animal cruelty as evidence of escalation and premeditation, and associated charges related to the planning and execution of the crimes. The arraignment on these adult charges was scheduled for the following week, at which time Erica would enter her plea and formal pretrial proceedings would begin. As Erica was led from the courtroom back to detention, now facing prosecution as an adult with the possibility of life imprisonment, observers noted that she took one final glance toward the media section, her expression unreadable, but her awareness of their attention unmistakable in the deliberate turn of her head to ensure her profile was visible to the sketch artists and reporters who would carry her image to the national audience she had, according to her own writings, been planning to capture through violence for months. Outside the courthouse, the media storm intensified as reporters clamored for statements from anyone connected to the proceedings. Martinez provided a brief professional summary of the ruling and next steps in the case, careful to avoid any appearance of grandstanding given the tragic circumstances and high-profile nature of the prosecution. Kaplan declined comment beyond stating that they respected the court's decision and would continue to provide vigorous representation for their client. Governor Harney left without speaking to the press, his security detail forming a protective barrier as he was escorted to a waiting vehicle. The public official now facing the unimaginable dual burden of grieving his murdered wife and daughter while reconciling with the reality that his surviving child had been charged as an adult for their killings. A devastating personal tragedy playing out under the unforgiving spotlight of national attention. As Erica Harney was returned to detention, now classified as a juvenile being held for adult prosecution, the case that had begun with a chilling encounter on Pine Ridge Trail moved toward its next phase. A full criminal trial that would examine in excruciating detail the actions of a 15-year-old who, according to the evidence presented, had methodically planned and executed the murder of her family members not in a moment of adolescent rage or impulsivity, but as a calculated experiment in power and control, driven by a desire for the very notoriety that now surrounded her name on news broadcasts across the nation. The Pitkin County District Court buzzed with tension on the opening day of Erica Harney's trial, the packed gallery reflecting the national interest that had only intensified during the 6 months of pretrial proceedings. Judge Rustin Harney had allowed limited media access, one pool camera positioned discreetly at the back of the courtroom, and selected print journalists occupying reserved seats in the last 2 rows, while maintaining strict decorum requirements that had been outlined to all attendees before proceedings began. Governor Declan Harney sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, visibly thinner than he had been before the murders, his political career now on indefinite hold as he focused on the trial of his daughter for the killing of his wife and younger child. The personal toll was etched in the new lines on his face, the gray that now dominated his once dark hair, and the haunted look that appeared whenever evidence photos were displayed on the courtroom monitors. Prosecutor Emily Martinez rose for her opening statement, her crimson blazer providing the only vivid color in the otherwise somber courtroom, as she approached the jury of 8 women and 4 men who had been selected after an exhaustive 2-week process. "This case is about calculation, not impulse," Martinez began, her voice steady and clear as she established the framework through which she wanted the jury to view the evidence they would hear. "It is about months of planning, research, and preparation by a defendant who, despite her youth, demonstrated a level of premeditation that would be extraordinary even in experienced adult offenders." She methodically outlined what the evidence would show: Erica's digital trail of research into murder methods and media coverage of killers, the journal entries documenting her plans, the deliberate staging of evidence at the crime scene, and her behavior before, during, and after the murders that demonstrated awareness rather than confusion or psychosis. "You will hear testimony about a turquoise pendant deliberately placed as a signature at the crime scene," Martinez continued, gesturing toward the evidence table where the item sat in its clear plastic evidence bag, the engraved EH, visible even from a distance. "You will see text messages the defendant sent to a burner phone she purchased herself, creating what she hoped would be a mysterious trail for investigators to follow." The prosecutor moved with measured steps in front of the jury box, establishing eye contact with each juror as she described the most disturbing element of premeditation: Erica's killing of a neighbor's dog 3 weeks before the murders as what she had termed in her journal a practice run to test her ability to take life without remorse. "This was not an impulsive act of a troubled teenager," Martinez emphasized, her tone somber rather than accusatory, "but a methodically executed plan by someone who studied famous murders, calculated how to achieve similar notoriety, and acted with full awareness of the consequences of her actions." Defense attorney Robert Chen, who had taken over Erica's representation from public defender Melissa Kaplan 2 months after the arraignment when the Harney family secured funds for private counsel, approached the jury with a different narrative framework. At 53, Chen had built his reputation defending high-profile cases where mental health and adolescent development were key factors, his compassionate but non-condescending style making him particularly effective with juries in cases involving young defendants. "The prosecution will present evidence of planning, of research, of behaviors that seem calculated," he acknowledged, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "What they cannot show you, what the evidence cannot reveal, is the complex psychological landscape of a 15-year-old mind shaped by neurobiological factors beyond her control." Chen didn't dispute the basic facts that Erica had killed her mother and sister, but asked the jury to consider the why behind these actions, suggesting that her extensive research and apparent planning represented not cold-blooded calculation, but a manifestation of obsessive thought patterns and distorted perceptions of reality. "You will hear expert testimony about adolescent brain development, about how trauma and psychological factors can create thought patterns that appear rational from the outside while being fundamentally disconnected from normal emotional and moral processing," he explained, setting the stage for what would clearly be a defense strategy focused on diminished capacity and mental health rather than factual innocence. "The law requires that criminal responsibility consider not just actions, but the mental state behind those actions," Chen concluded, asking the jury to keep an open mind about the complex psychological factors that would be presented during the trial. Throughout both opening statements, Erica Harney sat at the defense table displaying the same composed demeanor she had maintained during pretrial hearings, her appearance carefully managed in a conservative navy dress with a white collar that emphasized her youth while remaining appropriate for the serious setting. Most observers noted that she appeared to be monitoring the jury's reactions rather than engaging emotionally with the content of either attorney's statements, her eyes moving methodically from juror to juror as though assessing which narrative they found more compelling. When Martinez described the killing of the neighbor's dog as a practice run, several jurors visibly recoiled, a reaction Erica seemed to note with interest rather than concern, before adjusting her expression to one of appropriate solemnity when she noticed the pool camera focusing briefly on her. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Thomas and Margaret Wexler, whose morning hike had intersected with Erica's calculated exit from the murder scene. Thomas described their encounter with the blood-covered teenager who had made no attempt to hide evidence of violence and had instead appeared to be deliberately displaying her bloodied hands. She seemed almost proud, the retired Marine colonel testified, his military bearing evident as he recounted how Erica had shown none of the physical or emotional signs of shock he had witnessed in combat situations. When I asked if she was all right, she said, "I guess the game is up with what I can only describe as satisfaction rather than distress." Margaret Wexler's nursing background provided professional weight to her similar observations about Erica's unusual affect, her testimony emphasizing the teenager's interest in media presence and her composed demeanor while waiting for law enforcement to arrive. Detective Daniel Thompson followed, providing the jury with a comprehensive overview of the crime scene and investigation that had led to Erica's arrest and subsequent confession. Using carefully selected crime scene photographs displayed on monitors visible to the jury but shielded from gallery view out of respect for the victims and Governor Harney, Thompson walked through the evidence discovered on Pine Ridge Trail that August morning. The position of the bodies and blood evidence indicated that Jennifer Harney had attempted to protect her younger daughter before succumbing to her own injuries, he explained, his professional demeanor maintained despite the disturbing nature of the evidence he presented. The turquoise pendant with the initials EH was placed on a rock near Jennifer Harney's outstretched hand, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than being dropped accidentally during a struggle. Thompson's testimony then shifted to Erica's behavior during arrest, transport, and her subsequent 3-hour interview, during which she had provided detailed information about planning and executing the murders. She asked to fix her hair before her mugshot was taken, Thompson noted, a detail that caused several jurors to exchange glances, and expressed repeated interest in whether media outlets were covering her arrest. The most damning portion of his testimony concerned Erica's confession about killing the neighbor's dog 3 weeks before the murders, which she had described as a test of her ability to take life without emotional distress. Based on information provided in her confession, we were able to locate the remains of the animal buried in a wooded area behind the Harney and Miller properties, Thompson confirmed, with injuries consistent with the practice run she described in her journal and confession. Digital forensics expert Marcus Wong provided what many legal observers considered the most devastating testimony for the defense, presenting the jury with a comprehensive timeline of Erica's online activities and journal entries in the months leading up to the murders. Projected on courtroom screens, Wong showed searches for juvenile murder sentencing, how to fake psychosis, and famous teenage killers, alongside journal entries documenting Erica's plans with disturbing clarity. These documents were recovered from a password-protected folder on her laptop labeled Research Project, Wong explained, displaying a screenshot of the folder structure that included subfolders titled Famous Cases, Juvenile Sentencing, and My Plan. Most chilling was a document titled Media Strategy, containing Erica's analysis of how different killers had presented themselves during arrest and trial, with notes on which approaches garnered the most public attention. Throughout Wong's testimony, Erica maintained her composed demeanor, though observers noted subtle reactions to certain pieces of evidence, particularly when her journal entries were displayed, moments where what appeared to be satisfaction briefly crossed her face before being quickly suppressed. Chen objected repeatedly to the prosecution's use of these materials, arguing that journals represented private thoughts rather than intentions and that Internet searches were not evidence of plans to commit actual violence. Judge Harney overruled most of these objections, finding that the totality of evidence established relevance, though he instructed the jury to consider the context of teenage behavior and the distinction between thoughts and actions in their deliberations. The prosecution's case built methodically over 2 weeks, each witness adding layers to the picture of premeditation and calculation. Forensic evidence presented by crime lab technician Lucia Reyes confirmed that DNA recovered from beneath Jennifer Harney's fingernails matched Erica's profile, corroborating her confession that her mother had fought back before being overpowered. The hunting knife recovered from the stream near the crime scene, despite Erica's attempt to clean it, yielded partial DNA evidence consistent with both victims, the serration pattern matching the wounds documented in the autopsy report. Most telling was the turquoise pendant, which, when examined under microscopic analysis, revealed traces of Erica's DNA in the engraving crevices, confirming her account of placing it deliberately at the scene after the murders. Perhaps the most unexpected and powerful testimony came from Samuel Miller, the neighbor whose dog had disappeared 3 weeks before the murders. Previously unaware of the connection between his pet's disappearance and the Harney case, Miller described how he had assumed the animal had been taken by mountain predators when it failed to return from the yard. "We searched for days," he testified, his voice breaking slightly at the memory, but eventually accepted that wildlife had likely gotten him. It happens in our area. His testimony took on particular weight when Martinez displayed a journal entry recovered from Erica's laptop describing the killing. Miller's dog was an ideal test subject, large enough to require significant force, but unable to call for help. Surprisingly easy to lure away with treats, felt nothing during slight excitement after. Good sign that I can proceed with the main plan. The prosecution's psychological expert, Dr. Catherine Montgomery, provided clinical context for the evidence of planning and Erica's behavior before and after the murders. With 25 years of experience specializing in adolescent criminal psychology, Dr. Mule Montgomery offered a counterpoint to the defense's anticipated mental health strategy by explaining the distinction between typical teenage impulsivity and the level of calculation evident in Erica's actions. What the evidence demonstrates is not consistent with an impulsive act or psychotic break, she testified, but rather with what we would classify as instrumental violence. Violence used as a means to achieve specific goals, in this case apparently including notoriety and a sense of power or control. When asked directly about adolescent brain development and its implications for this case, Dr. Montgomery acknowledged that teenagers generally have less developed impulse control and consequence recognition than adults, but emphasized that Erica's extensive planning over months indicated that her actions were not the result of impulsive decision-making. The most dramatic moment in the prosecution's case came when Martinez played the audio recording of Erica's confession, allowing the jury to hear in her own words how she had planned and carried out the murders of her mother and sister. The courtroom fell completely silent as Erica's voice, calm, measured, and displaying none of the emotional distress typically heard from juvenile suspects, described selecting the hunting knife, choosing the remote section of trail, and attacking 9-year-old Laurel first to prevent her from escaping before turning on her mother. "I needed to know what it felt like to take a life," Erica's recorded voice stated with clinical detachment. and they were the most convenient test subjects. Governor Harney, who had been warned about the content of the recording, chose to remain in the courtroom but sat with eyes closed and head bowed during this portion of the evidence. His attorney, Alexander Rossi, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder as his daughter's voice dispassionately described killing his wife and younger child. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, they presented their final and perhaps most damning evidence, the text message Erica had sent from her phone to the burner number she had purchased herself. "The trail ends here," the message read, sent at 8:47 a.m. on August 12th, approximately 20 minutes after the estimated time of the murders, and before Erica had begun walking back toward the trailhead where she would encounter the Wexlers. Martinez methodically established through phone records and security camera footage from a convenience store that Erica had purchased the prepaid phone herself 3 weeks earlier, the same time frame in which she had killed the neighbor's dog as a practice run and begun accelerating her planning for the murders. This message, Martinez explained to the jury as she displayed it on the courtroom screens, was not sent to coordinate with an accomplice or to communicate with anyone else. It was created by the defendant as a piece of evidence, a signature of sorts, that she intended investigators to find, part of the narrative she was constructing around her crimes. This characterization aligned with Erica's confession, in which she had admitted to deliberately creating evidence trails that would be interesting to investigators and media, viewing the criminal investigation itself as part of her performance rather than something to evade or overcome. This final piece of evidence completed the prosecution's portrait of a teenager who had not just committed murder, but had choreographed the entire event, including her capture and the subsequent investigation, as part of a calculated bid for the notoriety she had researched so extensively. As Martinez rested the prosecution's case, the defense faced the daunting task of countering the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and calculation while acknowledging Erica's responsibility for the killings. Chen's strategy, as previewed in his opening statement, focused not on disputing the facts, but on providing a different framework for understanding Erica's mental state. "The prosecution has shown you extensive evidence of what the defendant did," Chen acknowledged in his first remarks after taking over the active phase of the trial. "Our purpose now is to help you understand why these actions occurred and the complex psychological factors that must be considered in determining the appropriate level of criminal responsibility." Chen's first witness was Dr. Nathan Lieberman, a neuropsychologist specializing in adolescent brain development, who explained how teenage brains differ structurally and functionally from adult brains, particularly in areas related to impulse control, risk assessment, and emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and decision-making, continues developing into the mid-20s, Dr. Lieberman testified, using simplified brain imaging slides to illustrate his points for the jury. This developmental reality means that adolescents process information and emotions differently than adults, often with reduced capacity to fully appreciate long-term consequences even when they intellectually understand them. This testimony aimed to establish a foundation for viewing Erica's extensive planning not as evidence of adult-like calculation, but as a manifestation of adolescent obsession and distorted thinking patterns. Dr. Lieberman carefully avoided making specific claims about Erica's individual mental state, focusing instead on general principles of adolescent neurology and development that might provide context for the jury. When Martinez cross-examined him, she focused on this distinction, asking whether months of documented planning and research were consistent with typical adolescent impulsivity. Planning and impulsivity are not mutually exclusive in adolescent psychology, Dr. Lieberman responded, maintaining his academic tone. An adolescent may meticulously plan certain aspects of behavior while still acting from fundamentally immature cognitive frameworks and emotional processing. Martinez pressed further, asking whether the specific behaviors documented in this case, the practice killing of an animal, the research into forensic countermeasures, the deliberate staging of evidence, aligned with typical adolescent decision-making, even accounting for developmental limitations. Dr. Lieberman acknowledged that these specific behaviors were unusual and concerning, even within the context of adolescent development. The defense's case continued with testimony from Dr. Eliza Ramirez, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted extensive evaluations of Erica during the pretrial period. Unlike the prosecution's psychological expert, who had focused on Erica's behavior patterns and evidence of calculation, Dr. Ramirez addressed what she characterized as underlying psychological factors that had shaped Erica's perceptions and decision-making. Based on my evaluations, I believe the defendant exhibits traits consistent with a personality disorder with psychopathic features. Dr. Ramirez testified, a diagnosis that on its surface appeared to support the prosecution's portrayal, but which Chen contextualized differently. These traits, particularly in an adolescent whose personality is still forming, represent a fundamental disconnect between cognitive understanding and emotional moral processing, essentially knowing intellectually that something is wrong without having the emotional capacity to fully appreciate the human impact of those actions. During Dr. Ramirez's testimony, Erica appeared to be particularly attentive, watching the psychiatrist with focused interest that some observers interpreted as assessment of how effectively the narrative being presented might serve her interests. This attention shifted to the jury as Dr. Ramirez described how individuals with psychopathic traits often engage in performance behavior designed to create specific impressions, suggesting that Erica's extensive planning and apparent calculation might represent not genuine criminal sophistication, but a form of psychological theater stemming from her fundamental disconnection from normal emotional processing. This framing attempted to recontextualize the very evidence that made the prosecution's case so strong, the planning, the research into famous killers, the staging of evidence, as manifestations of psychological disturbance rather than cold-blooded calculation. Martinez's cross-examination of Dr. Ramirez was methodical and focused, emphasizing the distinction between understanding and appreciating consequences. Dr. Ramirez, you've testified that the defendant has a fundamental disconnect between cognitive understanding and emotional processing, Martinez began, establishing the parameters of her questioning. Would you agree that the evidence shows the defendant understood that murder is legally prohibited and carries severe consequences? Dr. Ramirez acknowledged this point, unable to dispute the extensive evidence showing Erica had researched juvenile sentencing specifically. And would you agree that her research into juvenile sentencing guidelines, combined with her searches for how to fake psychosis and similar terms, indicates awareness that her actions would result in legal proceedings? Dr. Ramirez attempted to maintain her framing of Erica's behavior as stemming from psychological disturbance rather than calculation, but Martinez systematically established that, regardless of emotional processing deficits, the evidence demonstrated clear awareness of both legal and social consequences. The defendant may experience emotions differently than most people, Martinez concluded this line of questioning. But would you agree that the evidence indicates she understood exactly what she was doing, knew it was legally prohibited, and took steps to prepare for the consequences? After a pause that seemed to acknowledge the strength of this reasoning, Dr. Ramirez conceded, "The evidence does suggest awareness of legal consequences, yes, though I maintain that her appreciation of the human impact was likely impaired by her psychological profile." The defense case continued with testimony from Erica's school counselor, Sarah Jenkins, who described her interactions with Erica 6 months before the murders after a teacher had reported concerns about her researching serial killers during study hall. Jenkins testified that Erica had convincingly explained her research as being for an academic project comparing psychological profiles of different offenders. showing her an outline that appeared legitimate and demonstrating no concerning behaviors that would have warranted further intervention. She presented as a typical high-achieving student with academic interest in criminology. Jenkins explained, her testimony clearly painful as she grappled with the possibility that she had missed warning signs. In retrospect, there were subtle indicators that might have raised more concern in a different context. Her emotional detachment when discussing violent cases, her particular interest in killers who achieved notoriety. But at the time, these didn't trigger significant alarm given her academic framing of the research. Chen used Jenkins's testimony to reinforce the narrative of Erica as someone with fundamental psychological differences rather than simply a calculating killer, emphasizing how her ability to present a mask of normalcy represented not ordinary teenage deception but a symptom of her profound disconnect from typical emotional and moral processing. Jenkins' obvious distress at having been manipulated, as she described it, served Chen's strategy of portraying Erica as someone whose mental functioning was so fundamentally different from the norm that traditional concepts of criminal responsibility might not fully apply, despite her intellectual awareness of her actions' criminality. As the defense case progressed, Chen called several of Erica's former teachers and classmates to establish her history of maintaining appropriate social behavior while apparently concealing her violent ideation, testimony intended to support the narrative of psychological disturbance rather than simple criminal intent. These witnesses generally described Erica as quiet but academically successful, someone who participated appropriately in classes and activities without drawing undue attention to herself. One friend recalled Erica commenting that, "Some people aren't meant to have families," during a discussion about future plans, while another remembered her asking detailed questions about how the school had responded to a student's death the previous year, comments that in hindsight took on disturbing significance, but which at the time had seemed merely odd rather than alarming. Throughout the defense presentation, Erica maintained the same composed demeanor she had shown during the prosecution's case, occasionally making notes on a legal pad or leaning to whisper something to Chen, but otherwise sitting straight-backed and attentive. Several court observers noted that her expression and posture appeared to adjust subtly when the pool camera was active versus when it was not, suggesting an awareness of her visual presentation that aligned with Dr. Montgomery's earlier testimony about performance behavior, but which Chen had attempted to reframe as symptomatic of psychological disturbance rather than calculated manipulation. As the trial entered its fourth week, both prosecution and defense prepared for their final expert witnesses, closing arguments, and the jury deliberations that would determine whether 15-year-old Erica Harney would spend potentially the rest of her life in prison for the calculated murder of her mother and sister on Pine Ridge Trail. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but the question before the jury was not simply whether she had committed the killings, which even the defense acknowledged, but whether her youth and psychological profile mitigated her culpability in a way that should influence their verdict and the subsequent sentencing. Behind the legal arguments and expert testimonies lay the human tragedy that had unfolded on that August morning in Aspen, the lives cut short, and the grieving father who sat in the courtroom day after day, bearing witness to the proceedings that would determine the fate of his only surviving child. Sarah Jenkins clutched a tissue in her hand as she continued her testimony on the second day of her appearance, the school counselor's professional composure cracking under the weight of what she now recognized as a devastating failure to identify warning signs in Erica Harney's behavior. "I keep thinking about those 2 sessions," she admitted, her voice wavering slightly as she addressed a question from defense attorney Robert Chen about her interactions with Erica 6 months before the murders. She was so convincing about it being academic interest. She had a detailed outline, specific research questions, even citations for a paper comparing psychological profiles of different offenders. Jenkins paused, blinking back tears before continuing with visible effort. I've replayed those conversations countless times since August, looking for what I missed, but she presented exactly what an academically curious, high-achieving student would present. There was nothing that triggered alarm bells at the time. Chen guided Jenkins through a careful description of Erica's demeanor during those counseling sessions, establishing a picture of a teenager who had mastered the presentation of normalcy while concealing disturbing thoughts and plans. Would you say her affect, her emotional presentation, was typical for a student discussing academic research? He asked, leading Jenkins to one of the few retrospective warning signs she had identified. That's one thing that does stand out in hindsight, Jenkins acknowledged, regaining some professional steadiness as she analyzed the interaction. She discussed violent crimes with unusual detachment, almost like she was discussing characters in a novel rather than real events with real victims. This clinical distance, which Jenkins had initially attributed to academic objectivity, now appeared in a more disturbing light as potential evidence of the emotional disconnection that had enabled Erica to plan and execute violence against her own family members. During cross-examination, prosecutor Emily Martinez focused on Erica's apparent awareness of social expectations and her ability to craft a presentation that would allay concerns, qualities that supported the prosecution's portrayal of calculated behavior rather than psychological confusion. Ms. Jenkins, you've described how the defendant created a convincing academic framework for her research into killers, Martinez began, her tone respectful of Jenkins' obvious distress. Would you agree that this demonstrates an understanding of what would be considered appropriate versus concerning behavior? Jenkins nodded, acknowledging this point. She knew exactly what would raise red flags and what wouldn't, the counselor confirmed. And she crafted her explanation specifically to address the concerns her teacher had raised about her research. Martinez continued this line of questioning, establishing that Erica's ability to create a convincing cover story demonstrated awareness of social norms and expectations rather than confusion about them. Based on your professional experience, does the ability to recognize what others would find concerning and then construct a plausible alternative explanation suggest someone who doesn't understand social rules or someone who understands them well enough to work around them? Jenkins paused before answering, weighing her words carefully. It suggests someone who understands the rules very well, she finally acknowledged, but who sees them as external constraints to be managed rather than internalized guidelines. This distinction between understanding social norms and being guided by them would become central to the jury's deliberations about Erica's mental state and level of responsibility. Following Jenkins's testimony, the defense called Dr. Vanessa Clark, an expert in adolescent trauma and development, who attempted to provide context for Erica's behavior by examining potential developmental factors that might have shaped her psychological profile. Unlike previous defense witnesses who had focused primarily on general principles of adolescent brain development or clinical diagnoses, Dr. Clark addressed the specific circumstances of Erica's upbringing as the daughter of a high-profile political family. Children in public-facing families often develop compartmentalized identities, she explained, using slides to illustrate her points about the psychological impact of growing up under public scrutiny. There's the public self that meets external expectations and the private self that may harbor very different thoughts and feelings, particularly during adolescence, when identity formation is a central developmental task. Dr. Clark suggested that this compartmentalization, combined with the pressure of being a governor's daughter, might have contributed to Erica's psychological disconnection and her apparent fascination with notoriety achieved through violence. For adolescents who feel unseen as their authentic selves or who struggle with emotional connection, extreme acts can represent a distorted attempt to establish identity and significance, she testified, careful to note that she was not excusing or justifying the murders, but attempting to provide psychological context for understanding them. This framing attempted to recontextualize Erica's extensive planning and research not as evidence of cold calculation, but as manifestations of profound psychological disturbance rooted in developmental circumstances. Martinez's cross-examination of Dr. Clark was particularly effective in highlighting the speculative nature of this testimony, given the absence of any documented history of trauma or significant developmental disruption in Erica's background. Dr. Clark, have you identified any specific traumatic events or abusive patterns in the defendant's history that would support your theory about identity compartmentalization? Martinez asked, establishing that Clark's analysis was based on general principles rather than specific evidence from Erica's life. When Clark acknowledged that she had found no documentation of abuse, neglect, or significant trauma, Martinez pressed further. So your testimony is essentially that being raised in a well-resourced, stable home as the daughter of a public figure might have somehow contributed to planning and executing the murder of family members? Clark attempted to maintain her theoretical framework while acknowledging the limitations of its application to this specific case. But Martinez methodically established that the defense's psychological narrative lacked substantial evidentiary support from Erica's actual history and development. This exchange highlighted a key challenge for the defense throughout the trial: the absence of a clear precipitating factor or explanatory mechanism that might help the jury understand how a seemingly ordinary teenager from a stable family had methodically planned and carried out such violence against her own mother and sister. Without this explanatory framework, the prosecution's more straightforward narrative of calculation and desire for notoriety gained increasing traction as the trial progressed. The most anticipated testimony came when the defense called its final expert witness, Dr. James Thornton, a nationally recognized authority on juvenile psychopathy and development, who had conducted extensive evaluations of Erica during the pre-trial period. Unlike previous psychological witnesses, Dr. Thornton addressed directly the evidence, suggesting psychopathic traits, acknowledging their presence while providing a developmental context that the defense hoped might mitigate perceptions of Erica's culpability. Psychopathic traits in adolescence are not fixed or deterministic, he testified, distinguishing between adult and juvenile manifestations of these characteristics. The adolescent brain is still developing, particularly in areas related to emotional processing, empathy, and moral reasoning, which means that traits appearing at 15 do not necessarily predict adult functioning with appropriate intervention. Dr. Thornton's testimony was careful and nuanced, acknowledging the disturbing nature of Erica's actions and planning while suggesting that her age made her more amenable to rehabilitation than an adult with similar psychological characteristics might be. What we see in this case is a profound disconnect between cognitive understanding and emotional moral processing, he explained, echoing earlier testimony but providing more specific neurobiological mechanisms. The defendant appears to understand intellectually that murder is wrong and prohibited, but lacks the emotional architecture to fully appreciate the human impact of her actions in the way we would expect from someone with typical development. This framing attempted to establish a middle ground between excusing Erica's actions entirely and condemning her as fully responsible in the way an adult would be. Martinez's cross-examination focused on the extensive evidence of premeditation and Erica's apparent awareness of both legal and social consequences, challenging Dr. Thornton's suggestion that her understanding was primarily intellectual rather than comprehensive. Dr. Thornton, you've testified that the defendant lacks the emotional architecture to fully appreciate the impact of her actions, Martinez began, establishing the parameters of her questioning. Yet the evidence shows she researched juvenile sentencing guidelines specifically, suggesting she understood not only that murder is prohibited, but that her age might affect the consequences she would face. Would you agree that this demonstrates an awareness of potential consequences beyond mere intellectual understanding? Dr. Thornton acknowledged this point, but maintained his distinction between cognitive and emotional understanding. Researching sentencing guidelines demonstrates cognitive awareness of legal consequences, he conceded, but does not necessarily indicate emotional appreciation of the human impact of her actions. Martinez pressed further, referencing Erica's journal entries about killing the neighbor's dog as a practice run to test her emotional response before proceeding to human victims. Doesn't this methodical escalation suggest not just awareness, but deliberate assessment of her own emotional responses to taking life? She asked, challenging Dr. Thornton's framing. Wouldn't someone truly unable to appreciate the significance of their actions not need to test their capacity to carry them out? This exchange highlighted the central tension in the psychological testimony. Whether Erica's extensive planning, research, and apparent self-assessment represented disturbed thinking that mitigated responsibility or calculated behavior that established it. Dr. Thornton maintained his position that Erica's age and developmental stage meant her psychological functioning differed fundamentally from an adult's, regardless of the apparent sophistication of her planning. But Martinez effectively established that the evidence showed a level of awareness and calculation that transcended typical adolescent limitations in impulse control or consequence recognition. As the defense case neared its conclusion, Robert Chen called a final witness whose testimony would prove unexpectedly pivotal. Daniel Reeves, Erica's 10th grade history teacher, who had supervised the school's debate team on which Erica had participated the previous year. Unlike previous character witnesses who had described Erica as quiet and unremarkable, Reeves offered insight into her performance abilities that would inadvertently support the prosecution's portrait of calculated behavior. Erica was one of our strongest debaters, he testified, responding to Chen's questions about her academic performance. What made her particularly effective was her ability to argue either side of a proposition with equal conviction. She could present positions she didn't personally hold with complete believability. Chen had intended this testimony to support the defense narrative about compartmentalization and identity formation, but Martinez's cross-examination transformed it into evidence of Erica's capacity for performance and manipulation. Mr. Reeves, would you say that Erica's debate skills demonstrated an understanding of how to craft arguments that would be convincing to others? Martinez asked, building a parallel to the calculated behavior described in psychological testimony. Absolutely, Reeves confirmed. She had an unusual ability to read her audience and adjust her presentation to be most effective with different judges. Martinez continued this line of questioning, establishing that Erica had demonstrated sophisticated awareness of how to shape others' perceptions, exactly the skill that prosecution witnesses had described her employing during and after the murders. This unexpected reinforcement of the prosecution's narrative from a defense witness illustrated the difficulty Chen faced in presenting Erica's behaviors as manifestations of psychological disturbance rather than calculation. Each attempt to provide context or explanation for her actions seemed to circle back to the same conclusion, that Erica had demonstrated sophisticated awareness of social expectations, careful planning to achieve specific goals, and deliberate management of others' perceptions before, during, and after the murders. The debate team testimony intended to humanize Erica as a successful student instead reinforced her capacity for precisely the kind of performance behavior that the prosecution had argued demonstrated her understanding and intent. As both sides prepared for closing arguments, the trial had painted a complex but increasingly coherent picture of Erica Harney. Not as a typical teenager who had acted impulsively or a mentally ill individual who had experienced a psychotic break, but as someone with fundamental differences in psychological functioning who had leveraged her cognitive abilities to plan and execute violence, while lacking the emotional and moral constraints that typically prevent such actions. The question before the jury was not whether she had killed her mother and sister, or even whether she had planned to do so. The evidence for both was overwhelming. But how to weigh her youth and psychological profile against the calculated nature of her actions in determining the appropriate verdict and subsequent sentence. In his closing argument, Chen emphasized the developmental and psychological factors that he argued should influence the jury's assessment of Erica's culpability despite the disturbing nature of her actions. The law recognizes that young people are different, neurobiologically, psychologically, developmentally different from adults, he reminded the jury, his tone respectful of both the evidence presented and the gravity of their decision. This recognition isn't about excusing behavior, but about understanding that responsibility exists on a spectrum influenced by age, development, and psychological factors. He carefully acknowledged the overwhelming evidence while asking the jury to consider it through the lens of adolescent development and psychological disturbance rather than adult calculation. You've heard extensive testimony about the defendant's psychological profile, Chen continued, about the disconnect between cognitive understanding and emotional processing that can occur in adolescent development, particularly when complicated by personality factors that affect empathy and moral reasoning. This framing attempted to provide a middle path for the jury, acknowledging Erica's actions and awareness while suggesting that her youth and psychological profile should influence their assessment of her level of responsibility and, by extension, the appropriate verdict. Chen concluded by reminding the jury that their decision would not only determine Erica's fate, but would reflect society's approach to juvenile justice in cases involving serious crimes. The question before you is not simply what the defendant did, but how our justice system responds to a 15-year-old whose actions reflect profound psychological disturbance rather than typical criminal intent. Martinez's closing argument acknowledged the defense's psychological testimony while refocusing the jury on the extensive evidence of premeditation, calculation, and awareness that had been presented throughout the trial. The defense has asked you to view the defendant's actions through the lens of adolescent development and psychological disturbance, she began, her tone measured rather than accusatory. I ask you to view them through the lens of the evidence that shows not impulsivity or confusion, but months of methodical planning, research into murder methods and forensic countermeasures, and deliberate staging of evidence to create the narrative the defendant wanted to present to investigators and media. Martinez methodically revisited the key evidence, Erica's digital trail of research into murder methods and juvenile sentencing, her journal entries documenting plans and her practice run with the neighbor's dog, the text message sent to a burner phone she had purchased herself, and the turquoise pendant deliberately placed as a signature at the crime scene. This is not the evidence of someone acting from developmental limitations or psychological confusion, she argued, but of someone who understood exactly what they were doing, knew it was wrong, and proceeded anyway with clear awareness of potential consequences. This framing directly challenged the defense's narrative of diminished capacity due to age and psychological factors, emphasizing instead the calculated nature of Erica's actions as demonstrated by the extensive evidence presented during trial. The defendant researched juvenile sentencing specifically, Martinez reminded the jury, highlighting a point that had been particularly damaging to the defense's psychological narrative. She studied how the legal system responds to teenagers who commit murder. She searched for how to fake psychosis and similar terms. These are not the actions of someone unaware of consequences or unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions. They are the actions of someone who understood the potential consequences and planned accordingly. Martinez concluded by asking the jury to return verdicts that reflected this evidence of premeditation and awareness, rather than being swayed by general principles about adolescent development that might not fully apply to the specific facts of this case. as Judge Harney delivered his instructions to the jury, explaining the legal elements of each charge and the standard of proof required for conviction. Erica Harney maintained the same composed demeanor she had displayed throughout the trial. Governor Harney, seated in his now familiar position in the front row behind the prosecution table, watched with the haunted expression that had become his public face since the murders, the political leader now defined by personal tragedy rather than policy positions or campaign promises. The case that had begun with a chilling encounter on Pine Ridge Trail had exposed not only the calculated violence of a 15-year-old against her family members, but the devastating aftermath for the survivors, left to make sense of actions that defied conventional understanding. The jury deliberated for 27 hours over 3 days, their extended discussions suggesting careful consideration of the complex psychological testimony presented alongside the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and calculation. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable as the foreman handed their verdict forms to the bailiff, who delivered them to Judge Harney for review before they were read aloud. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Harney, we the jury find the defendant, Erica Harney, guilty, the clerk announced, proceeding through identical verdicts for the murder of Laurel Harney, animal cruelty and the killing of the neighbor's dog, and the associated charges related to premeditation and special circumstances. As the verdicts were read, Erica's expression remained largely unchanged, though observers noted a momentary tightening of her jaw at the word guilty. Not apparent distress, but what seemed like annoyance quickly masked by a return to her composed demeanor. Governor Harney closed his eyes briefly at each pronouncement, his posture suggesting not satisfaction, but the grim acknowledgment of justice that would do nothing to heal his devastating loss. The jury had apparently found the evidence of calculation and premeditation more compelling than the defense's arguments about adolescent development and psychological factors, returning verdicts that reflected their assessment that Erica had acted with full awareness of the nature and consequences of her actions despite her youth. Judge Harney scheduled sentencing for the following month, ordering an updated pre-sentence investigation to inform his decision about appropriate punishment given the defendant's age and the severity of the crimes. As Erica was led from the courtroom, she took a final glance toward the media section, her awareness of public attention evident in this small gesture that reinforced the prosecution's portrait of someone whose actions had been partly motivated by desire for notoriety. The case that had shocked the nation would soon enter its final phase, with the sentencing hearing representing the last opportunity for both sides to shape the narrative about appropriate consequences for a 15-year-old who had methodically planned and executed the murder of her family members on Pine Ridge Trail. 3 weeks after the guilty verdicts, the atmosphere in the Pitkin County District Court had shifted from the tense anticipation of trial to the somber gravity of sentencing as all parties prepared for what would likely be the final chapter in the legal proceedings against Erica Harney. Court officers had once again established strict security protocols, managing the continued media interest while ensuring appropriate decorum for proceedings that would determine whether a 15-year-old would spend potentially the rest of her life in prison. Governor Declan Harney entered through the same secured side entrance he had used throughout the trial, the past months having etched permanent grief into features that once projected political confidence and authority. The weight of his dual role, father of both the convicted murderer and her young victim, husband of the woman killed alongside their child, showed in his careful movements as he took his place in the courtroom, a living embodiment of the human devastation that statistics about family violence failed to capture. Prosecutor Emily Martinez arrived with her team, carrying the materials they would present during this crucial phase, where the focus shifted from establishing guilt to determining appropriate punishment. Unlike the trial, where Martinez had maintained a strictly professional demeanor focused on evidence and legal arguments, the sentencing hearing would require her to address more directly the emotional and societal impact of Erica's crimes while navigating the complex considerations involving juvenile sentencing. At 42, Martinez had handled numerous high-profile cases, but acknowledged privately to colleagues that few had affected her as deeply as this one: the calculated violence, the young age of both perpetrator and victims, and the complete destruction of a family requiring a careful balance between justice and recognition of developmental factors that the law required be considered, even in cases of extreme violence. Defense attorney Robert Chen entered alongside psychologist Dr. James Thornton, their expressions suggesting awareness of the uphill battle they faced at sentencing given the jury's rejection of their arguments about diminished capacity due to age and psychological factors. Chen had spent the week since the verdict preparing for what many legal observers considered an almost impossible task: convincing Judge Harney to impose anything less than the maximum sentence given the calculated nature of the crimes and the overwhelming evidence of premeditation that had led to guilty verdicts on all counts. His strategy would focus on constitutional principles regarding juvenile sentencing. Recent Supreme Court precedents establishing that even in cases of horrific violence, a juvenile's age must be considered as potentially mitigating, and the rehabilitation potential that existed simply by virtue of Erica's developmental stage, regardless of the disturbing nature of her crimes. Erica Harney was the last to enter, escorted by 2 officers, her appearance noticeably different from the conservative, youthful styling she had maintained during trial. She had grown thinner during her months in detention, the navy jumpsuit hanging loosely from shoulders that seemed narrower than before, her previously neat hair now pulled back severely from a face that appeared sharper, more defined by the weight loss. Most striking was her expression, the practiced vulnerability she had often displayed for the jury, now replaced by a more neutral affect that some observers interpreted as resignation, while others saw as continued calculation in a proceeding where the jury's emotional response was no longer relevant. She took her seat beside Chen without acknowledging her father or the courtroom gallery, her posture straight, but her eyes focused downward on the table surface rather than scanning the room as she had often done during trial. Judge Rustin Harney began the proceedings with a brief explanation of the sentencing process, outlining the factors he was required to consider under Colorado law and recent Supreme Court precedents regarding juvenile sentencing. The court must balance multiple considerations, he explained, his tone reflecting the gravity of the decision before him, including the severity of the offenses, the defendant's age and potential for rehabilitation, public safety concerns, and constitutional principles established by the Supreme Court regarding proportionality in juvenile sentencing. He emphasized that while the jury had determined guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the sentencing decision required separate analysis that took into account both the specific circumstances of the crimes and broader legal principles about appropriate punishment for juvenile offenders, regardless of the severity of their actions. Martinez opened the state's presentation, approaching the podium with a manila folder containing victim impact statements and her sentencing recommendations based on Colorado statutes and case law. Your Honor, the crimes committed by the defendant represent the most extreme form of premeditated violence. The calculated murder of family members, including a 9-year-old child, preceded by months of planning, and the killing of an animal as what the defendant herself described as a practice run. She began, her voice steady but carrying the weight appropriate to the subject matter. The evidence presented at trial established not only the defendant's actions, but her mindset. Her extensive research into murder methods and media coverage of killers, her creation of evidence trails designed to capture attention, and her apparent motivation to achieve notoriety through violence. Martinez methodically outlined the aggravating factors that she argued justified the maximum sentence allowed under law despite Erica's age, the extreme premeditation demonstrated through digital evidence and journal entries, the vulnerability of 9-year-old Laurel Harney as a victim, the deliberate killing of the neighbor's dog as escalation toward human violence, and perhaps most significantly, the absence of any mitigating circumstances, such as abuse, neglect, or significant trauma that might have contributed to the crimes. What makes this case particularly disturbing from a sentencing perspective, Martinez continued, is that the defendant appears to have had every advantage: a stable home, educational opportunities, economic security, yet methodically planned and executed the murder of her family members, not from desperation or trauma response, but from what the evidence suggests was a desire for control and notoriety. The prosecutor then presented what would become the most compelling evidence in the sentencing phase: the comprehensive analysis of Erica's internet search history in the weeks before the murders, focusing particularly on her research into juvenile sentencing guidelines and media coverage of teenage killers who had achieved fame through violence. Your Honor, perhaps the most telling evidence regarding appropriate sentencing comes from the defendant's own research, Martinez explained, displaying screenshots of search queries on the courtroom monitors. These searches, conducted in the weeks immediately preceding the murders, include maximum juvenile sentence for double murder, states with most lenient juvenile sentencing, famous teen killers who got book deals, and perhaps most telling, how long before juvenile murderers get released. Digital forensics expert Marcus Wong returned to the stand to provide context for these searches, explaining how they formed part of a pattern that suggested Erica had considered potential consequences before committing the murders and had specifically researched how her age might affect sentencing outcomes. The search pattern indicates someone methodically gathering information about juvenile sentencing across different jurisdictions, Wong testified, displaying a timeline that showed these searches becoming more frequent and specific in the 2 weeks before the murders. Particularly notable is this search from August 5th, just 1 week before the homicides. Difference between juvenile and adult murder sentences, Colorado, followed by visits to legal websites explaining Colorado's juvenile sentencing statutes. This evidence proved particularly damaging to the defense's arguments about diminished capacity and development, suggesting that Erica had not only understood the criminality of her planned actions, but had specifically researched how her age might shield her from the harshest consequences, essentially attempting to game the juvenile justice system to receive lenient treatment despite extensive premeditation. Wong further testified that Erica had visited websites discussing recent Supreme Court cases limiting juvenile life sentences, suggesting awareness of the very legal principles the defense now hoped to leverage for a reduced sentence. The digital evidence suggests not only awareness of consequences, Wong concluded, but specific planning around legal outcomes based on age considerations. Martinez then presented victim impact statements, beginning with a written statement from Governor Harney that the court clerk read aloud to maintain the governor's composure during this painful process. I come before this court in an unimaginable position, grieving my murdered wife and daughter while facing the reality that my surviving child committed these horrific acts. The statement began, the formal language barely containing the raw grief evident in every sentence. Jennifer was not just my wife, but my partner in every sense, someone whose compassion and intelligence made everyone around her better. Laurel was only beginning her life, a bright, curious 9-year-old with endless potential, now forever unrealized. The statement continued with personal remembrances of both victims before addressing the impossible position of a father facing his child's sentencing. I cannot reconcile the daughter I raised with the calculated violence she inflicted on our family. While I will always love Erica as my child, I believe there must be consequences proportionate to actions that demonstrate such profound disregard for human life. Additional victim impact statements came from Jennifer Harney's sister, Catherine, and from Samuel Miller, whose dog had been killed by Erica as what she had termed a practice run before the murders. Catherine's statement focused on the devastating impact of losing both her sister and niece while grappling with the knowledge that her other niece had committed the murders, describing the layers of grief that have no roadmap or precedent in her experience. Miller's statement provided unexpected emotional weight by connecting Erica's progression from animal cruelty to human violence. "When our dog disappeared, we grieved what we thought was a natural loss," he wrote, never imagining he had been killed as preparation for human murder. Learning that his death was part of a calculated plan to test capacity for violence before moving on to people has added horror to our grief and raised devastating questions about whether his death could have been a warning sign that might have prevented the greater tragedy that followed. Martinez concluded the state's presentation with a direct address of the tension between Erica's age and the calculated nature of her crimes. "Your Honor, the Supreme Court has rightly established that juvenile offenders must be considered differently than adults at sentencing, acknowledging the potential for rehabilitation that exists by virtue of their ongoing development," she acknowledged, demonstrating awareness of the legal principles that would guide Judge Harney's decision. However, these principles do not preclude substantial punishment when the circumstances warrant. In this case, the defendant's own research into juvenile sentencing advantages, combined with the extraordinary level of premeditation and the absence of mitigating factors such as abuse or trauma, suggests that the maximum sentence allowed under law would be both proportionate to the crimes committed and consistent with constitutional principles regarding juvenile sentencing. Robert Chen began the defense presentation by acknowledging the severity of Erica's crimes while framing his arguments within constitutional principles rather than attempting to minimize her actions. "Your Honor, the defense does not contest the gravity of these offenses or the pain they have caused to the victims' loved ones," he began, his tone respectful of both the court and the human suffering underlying the legal proceedings. "Our arguments at sentencing are based not on disputing these facts, but on constitutional principles established by the Supreme Court regarding juvenile sentencing that must inform Your Honor's decision, regardless of the disturbing nature of the crimes before the court." Chen methodically outlined the relevant Supreme Court precedents: Roper v. Simmons, Graham v. Florida, Miller v. Alabama, and Montgomery v. Louisiana, establishing that juvenile offenders must be treated differently than adults at sentencing, even in cases of extreme violence. These decisions reflect scientific understanding about adolescent brain development and recognize that juveniles have diminished culpability compared to adults, Chen argued. Not because their actions are less serious, but because their developmental stage inherently includes greater capacity for change and rehabilitation. This framing attempted to shift focus from the details of Erica's crimes to broader principles about proportionate punishment for juvenile offenders regardless of the severity of their actions. Dr. James Thornton returned to provide testimony specifically focused on rehabilitation potential rather than the psychological factors he had addressed during trial. Even in cases involving behavior that appears calculated or predatory in nature, the adolescent brain retains significant plasticity that makes meaningful change possible with appropriate intervention, he testified. Citing research studies on juvenile offenders who had committed serious violent crimes but demonstrated significant rehabilitation with specialized treatment programs. When Judge Harney questioned him directly about whether this general principle applied to Erica specifically given the evidence of planning and apparent lack of remorse, Dr. Thornton acknowledged the particular challenges her case presented while maintaining that her age alone created rehabilitation possibilities that would not exist for an adult offender with similar psychological characteristics. Chen's most compelling argument came when he addressed Erica's research into juvenile sentencing. Attempting to reframe what the prosecution had presented as evidence of calculation, as instead demonstrating the very developmental limitations that juvenile sentencing principles are designed to address. The prosecution has highlighted the defendant's internet searches about juvenile sentencing as evidence of calculation, Chen acknowledged, but I would suggest that these searches actually demonstrate the limitations in adolescent thinking about consequences. A focus on technical outcomes rather than human impact, on procedural details rather than moral weight. This is precisely the kind of limited, concrete thinking about consequences that developmental experts identify as characteristic of adolescent cognition compared to adult understanding. This attempt to incorporate even the most damaging evidence into a developmental framework represented Chen's strongest effort to provide Judge Harney with a rationale for anything less than the maximum sentence, though courtroom observers noted the judge's skeptical expression during this portion of the argument. Chen concluded by emphasizing that the court's decision would establish important precedent about how society responds to juvenile violence, even in its most disturbing manifestations. The question before Your Honor is not whether these crimes deserve serious punishment. They unquestionably do, but whether our justice system can maintain its commitment to principles of proportionality and potential rehabilitation, even in cases that test those principles most severely. Following these presentations, Judge Harney asked if the defendant wished to make a statement before sentencing, a standard procedure that took on particular significance given Erica's calculated behavior throughout the proceedings. After a brief consultation with Chen, Erica rose and approached the podium, her movements deliberate and her expression composed as she faced the judge. Your Honor, I want to express my profound remorse for my actions and the pain I have caused my father and our entire community, she began, her voice clear and steady, making occasional eye contact with Judge Harney in what appeared to be a carefully practiced performance of contrition. I know that nothing I can say will bring back my mother and sister or undo the damage I have caused, but I hope that with time and appropriate treatment I might come to better understand my actions and eventually make some positive contribution despite the terrible harm I have inflicted. As Erica continued her statement, describing her deep regret and commitment to rehabilitation, something in her delivery caught Judge Harney's attention, a subtle disconnect between her words and affect, a polished quality to her remorse that seemed rehearsed rather than authentic. Partway through what was clearly a prepared speech about her potential for change and growth, Judge Harney raised his hand, interrupting her mid-sentence with a directness that sent murmurs through the courtroom despite strict decorum requirements. Ms. Harney, I'm going to stop you there, he stated, his expression stern as he looked directly at her. Your performance is as unconvincing as your remorse. The bluntness of this assessment visibly startled Erica, whose composed expression faltered momentarily before she attempted to continue her statement. Your Honor, I assure you my remorse is genuine, she began, but Judge Harney interrupted again with a finality that made clear he would not allow the performance to continue. You may be seated, he directed, his tone leaving no room for argument. This court has reviewed extensive evidence of your actions before, during, and after these murders, including your own writings about achieving notoriety. I find your prepared statement of remorse inconsistent with that evidence and will not allow these proceedings to become another platform for performance. This extraordinary intervention, a judge directly challenging the authenticity of a defendant's expression of remorse, created a pivotal moment in the sentencing hearing, one that many legal observers would later identify as the point at which any possibility of a sentence less than the maximum allowable under law effectively disappeared. As Erica returned to her seat, observers noted a momentary shift in her demeanor. A flash of what appeared to be anger or frustration, quickly suppressed as she regained her composed expression, though with noticeably less affect than before, as though abandoning a performance that had been deemed unsuccessful. This brief but telling reaction, caught by the courtroom sketch artist who had documented the proceedings throughout trial, would be widely reproduced in subsequent media coverage as visual evidence of the calculating behavior that multiple witnesses had described during testimony. Judge Harney recessed court for 1 hour to finalize his sentencing decision, returning with a detailed written ruling that addressed both the specific circumstances of Erica's crimes and the broader legal principles regarding juvenile sentencing that he was required to consider. This court is presented with an extraordinary case that tests the boundaries of our juvenile justice principles, he began, his expression grave as he delivered his ruling. The defendant, at age 15, committed murders of exceptional premeditation and calculation, preceded by the killing of an animal as what she termed a practice run, and followed by behavior demonstrating awareness rather than confusion or remorse. The judge methodically outlined the factors he had considered, acknowledging Supreme Court precedents requiring that juvenile offenders be treated differently than adults, while emphasizing that these principles did not preclude substantial punishment when warranted by the circumstances. The evidence presented at trial and sentencing established not only the defendant's actions, but her mindset, extensive research into murder methods, forensic countermeasures, and perhaps most tellingly, juvenile sentencing guidelines suggesting awareness of how her age might affect legal consequences for actions she clearly understood were wrong. This assessment directly addressed the tension between Erica's youth and her apparent calculation, concluding that her behavior demonstrated a level of planning and awareness that transcended typical limitations in adolescent decision-making. While the court must consider the defendant's potential for rehabilitation by virtue of her age, Judge Harney continued, this consideration must be balanced against public safety concerns and the extraordinary premeditation evident in this case. He specifically referenced Erica's research into juvenile sentencing and famous teenage killers as evidence that she had attempted to leverage her age as protection against consequences for actions she had planned with clear awareness of their criminality. The defendant's own internet searches demonstrate she researched juvenile sentencing specifically, suggesting she selected her victims and timing with consideration of how her age would affect potential punishment, essentially attempting to game the system designed to protect juveniles from disproportionate consequences for actions influenced by developmental limitations. With these considerations established, Judge Harney delivered his sentence. For the first-degree murder of Jennifer Harney, this court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. For the first-degree murder of Laurel Harney, this court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years, to run consecutively with the first count. This consecutive sentencing meant Erica would serve a minimum of 50 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration, effectively ensuring she would remain incarcerated until at least age 65. Additional sentences for animal cruelty and the special circumstance charges were imposed to run concurrently, with Judge Harney specifying that Erica would serve her sentence in a specialized juvenile facility until age 18, at which point she would be transferred to adult corrections. The judge concluded with a direct address to Erica that made clear his assessment of her actions and motivation. The evidence presented to this court suggests you committed these crimes not from developmental limitations or traumatic response, but from a calculated desire for control and notoriety. Your extensive planning, your creation of evidence, trails designed to capture attention, and your apparent interest in media coverage suggest that fame was a primary motivation for violence against your own family members. His final statement served as both individual assessment and broader societal message. This sentence reflects both the extraordinary premeditation evident in your crimes and the principle that while youth may mitigate culpability in many contexts, it does not excuse the methodical planning and execution of murder, particularly when that planning includes specific research into how juvenile status might limit consequences. As the sentence was pronounced, Governor Harney closed his eyes briefly, his expression reflecting not satisfaction, but grim acknowledgment of justice that would do nothing to heal the losses he had suffered. Erica's reaction was subtle, but noted by several observers, a tightening of her jaw and a momentary flash of what appeared to be anger rather than distress, particularly at Judge Harney's direct assessment of her motivation and rejection of her performed remorse. This fleeting display of genuine emotion, quickly suppressed as she returned to a more neutral affect, provided final confirmation of the calculated behavior that multiple witnesses had described throughout the proceedings. As Erica was led from the courtroom, now sentenced to spend at least the next 50 years in prison for the murders of her mother and sister, the case that had begun with a chilling encounter on Pine Ridge Trail reached its legal conclusion. The sentencing established both individual accountability for calculated violence and broader principles about how the justice system responds to juvenile offenders, even in cases of extreme premeditation. While Erica's age had been considered as required by constitutional principles, her extensive planning, research into consequences, and apparent motivation for notoriety had ultimately led to what many legal observers described as an appropriate balancing of juvenile justice considerations with the reality of crimes that demonstrated calculation beyond typical adolescent limitations. As news of Erica Harney's sentence spread across national media outlets, the courthouse in Aspen became the focal point for renewed public discourse about juvenile justice, psychological evaluation of young offenders, and the balance between rehabilitation and punishment in cases of extreme violence. Legal analysts on morning shows debated whether Judge Harney's sentence, life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 50 years, appropriately considered Supreme Court precedents regarding juvenile sentencing while acknowledging the extraordinary premeditation evident in Erica's crimes. True crime podcasters rushed to produce special episodes analyzing the case with particular focus on Erica's research into famous killers and her apparent desire for notoriety that had been highlighted in both the prosecution's case and Judge Harney's sentencing remarks. Public reaction spanned the expected spectrum, with some arguing the sentence was too harsh given Erica's age regardless of her crimes, while others insisted that her calculated violence warranted permanent incarceration despite developmental considerations. Inside the Aspen Women's Correctional Facility, where Erica would remain in a specialized juvenile unit until her 18th birthday, the first weeks following sentencing established patterns that would be documented in subsequent case reports and evaluations. Unlike many newly sentenced juveniles who typically experience depression, anxiety, or anger upon beginning long sentences, Erica displayed what staff psychologist Dr. Meredith Walker characterized as unusual composure and apparent satisfaction with her new environment. Her intake evaluation noted particular interest in media coverage of her case, with repeated requests for newspapers and magazines containing articles about her trial and sentencing. Subject appears more concerned with her public portrayal than with the reality of her circumstances, Dr. Walker documented in her initial assessment, suggesting continued focus on notoriety rather than recognition of the permanence of her situation. Governor Declan Harney returned to Denver following the sentencing, his security detail creating a protective barrier against the media that continued to seek statements about his daughter's crimes and punishment. In a brief press conference held at the governor's mansion rather than his official office, Harney announced he would take a 30-day leave of absence to begin the process of healing and rebuilding following the conclusion of legal proceedings. "The justice system has completed its work," he stated, his voice steady despite the visible toll of the past months evident in his appearance. "But the personal work of grieving my wife and daughter while reconciling with the actions of my surviving child is only beginning." Political analysts noted the careful balance in his statement, which acknowledged the appropriateness of the legal outcome without specifically endorsing the severity of his daughter's sentence, a position that reflected his impossible situation as both father of the perpetrator and husband and father of the victims. In the weeks following sentencing, as public attention began to shift to other news, the professionals who had been involved in Erica's case continued their work processing the disturbing material they had encountered. Detective Daniel Thompson met with the department psychologist for a recommended debriefing. Acknowledging that despite his 23 years in law enforcement, the calculated nature of Erica's crimes and her apparent lack of remorse had affected him more deeply than he initially realized. "It's the planning that gets to me," he admitted during the session. The journal entries about killing the dog as a test run, the research into famous killers, the way she staged evidence to be found, all from a 15-year-old who should have been worried about normal teenage things. The department had established mandatory psychological support for all officers involved in the case, recognizing the particular toll of investigating crimes against children, especially those committed by another child. Prosecutor Emily Martinez faced similar psychological challenges as she organized the case files for final archiving, reviewing once more the evidence that had led to conviction and the maximum sentence allowable for a juvenile under Colorado law. The digital forensics reports documenting Erica's research into murder methods, famous killers, and juvenile sentencing guidelines created a particularly disturbing portrait of premeditation from someone so young, while the journal entries describing her practice run with the neighbor's dog revealed a progression of violence that had clear implications for public safety regardless of the perpetrator's age. "We achieved the right legal outcome," Martinez reflected in a conversation with her colleague, James Conner. "But there's no satisfaction in it, only the recognition that the system worked as intended in a case where the facts were so clearly established and the premeditation so thoroughly documented." Defense attorney Robert Chen experienced the professional challenges familiar to attorneys who represent clients in high-profile cases involving disturbing violence, balancing his ethical obligation to provide zealous representation with his personal reactions to the evidence presented during trial. In a guest lecture at the University of Colorado Law School 3 months after sentencing, Chen addressed the tensions inherent in defending juveniles charged with serious crimes. "Our system requires that every defendant receive vigorous representation regardless of the charges or evidence against them," he explained to the students. "But cases like Erica Harney's test that principle by forcing us to confront behavior that seems to transcend our usual frameworks for understanding juvenile offending." Chen acknowledged that while he had presented the strongest possible arguments about adolescent brain development and rehabilitation potential, the evidence of calculation and premeditation had made these arguments particularly challenging to frame persuasively. For the educational and mental health professionals who had interacted with Erica before the murders, the conclusion of legal proceedings brought little resolution to their ongoing process of examining missed warning signs and opportunities for intervention. Sarah Jenkins, the school counselor who had tearfully testified about being manipulated by Erica during their sessions 6 months before the murders, requested a transfer to a different school district, finding it impossible to continue in her role at the institution where she had failed to recognize the dangerous potential in a student's research into serial killers. "I keep thinking about those conversations," she confided to a colleague before leaving. "How completely she presented the academic framework for her interest in murder cases. How thoroughly I accepted her explanation without digging deeper or following up more extensively." Despite reassurances from administrators and fellow counselors that no reasonable professional would have identified Erica's research as imminent warning signs given her presentation, Jenkins remained haunted by what she viewed as a catastrophic failure of professional judgment. The Miller family, whose dog had been killed by Erica as what she termed a practice run before moving on to human victims, struggled with their own complex emotions about their unwitting peripheral role in the tragedy. If we had reported his disappearance as suspicious rather than assuming wildlife got him, could the authorities have connected it to Erica? Samuel Miller wondered in a support group for families affected by violent crime. Could Jennifer and Laurel still be alive if we had pushed for an investigation? These unanswerable questions represented the ripple effects of violence that extended far beyond the immediate victims and perpetrator, affecting even those with tangential connections to events they had no way of predicting or preventing. The support group facilitator gently reminded Miller that responsibility lay solely with Erica for her calculated actions, but the family continued to grapple with their place in a narrative that had escalated from animal cruelty to family annihilation. 6 months after sentencing, as public attention had largely moved on to other cases and controversies, Aspen Regional High School held a private dedication ceremony for a memorial garden honoring Jennifer and Laurel Harney. The location, a quiet courtyard away from main campus pathways, had been selected to provide a peaceful reflection space while avoiding creating what the planning committee described as inadvertent notoriety tourism that might sensationalize the tragedy. Governor Harney attended the dedication, his first public appearance in Aspen since the trial conclusion. Accompanied by his late wife's sister, Catherine, and a small security detail that kept media at a respectful distance. Jennifer believed profoundly in education as a force for growth and positive change, he said during brief remarks at the ceremony. And Laurel approached learning with a curiosity and joy that inspired everyone around her. The garden featured a small fountain, native plantings, and a simple stone bench engraved with, "In loving memory of Jennifer and Laurel Harney," without mention of the circumstances of their deaths, a deliberate choice to honor their lives rather than defining them by their murder. In juvenile detention, Erica's behavior continued to provide material for the ongoing psychological assessments required by both the court and the correctional system's treatment protocols. Unlike many juvenile offenders who displayed emotional volatility, depression, or aggressive acting out, Erica maintained the composed demeanor that had characterized her courtroom presentation, with staff noting her particular focus on managing how she was perceived by others. Subject demonstrates sophisticated awareness of how different behaviors are interpreted by staff, documented Dr. Walker in a quarterly assessment, adjusting her presentation based on which personnel are present and what outcomes she appears to be seeking in specific interactions. This continued performance behavior aligned with the assessments provided during trial by both prosecution and defense psychological experts, suggesting that despite the conclusion of legal proceedings, Erica remained focused on managing others' perceptions rather than engaging authentically with the reality of her crimes and their consequences. The psychological treatment team established a specialized protocol for Erica based on research into juvenile offenders with psychopathic traits, focusing on concrete behavioral management rather than emotion-based approaches that would likely prove ineffective given her psychological profile. Traditional therapeutic models emphasizing empathy development and emotional processing have shown limited effectiveness with individuals displaying similar traits, noted the treatment plan documented in her file. While approaches focusing on logical consequences and prosocial behavior as a path to desired outcomes have demonstrated better results. This pragmatic approach acknowledged the limitations identified in psychological testimony during trial, while attempting to leverage Erica's intelligence and apparent desire for positive attention into behavioral changes that might, over time, create pathways for more fundamental development, even if the underlying psychological architecture remained largely unchanged. Governor Harney faced his own complex healing process, balancing private grief with public responsibilities as he gradually resumed his official duties following his leave of absence. His staff noted a fundamental change in his approach to governance, a deeper focus on family support systems, mental health resources, and early intervention programs that might identify concerning behaviors before they escalated to violence. The governor has directed us to prioritize initiatives supporting family mental health services and school-based psychological resources, his chief of staff explained to department heads during a budget planning meeting, carefully avoiding direct reference to the personal tragedy that had clearly motivated this shift in priorities. Harney himself spoke only rarely about his family in public contexts, declining numerous interview requests from national outlets seeking the inside story of the case that had captured public attention, instead focusing his public communications on policy initiatives and state business. In an unexpected development that generated renewed media interest approximately 8 months after sentencing, Erica's journal, portions of which had been entered as evidence during trial, became the subject of a legal battle over publication rights. A true crime publisher had apparently contacted Erica through approved channels at the juvenile detention facility, expressing interest in releasing an edited version of her writings with commentary from criminologists and psychologists analyzing her case. Governor Harney immediately filed for an injunction to prevent publication, arguing that as Erica's only surviving parent and legal guardian, he had authority to block commercial exploitation of materials related to crimes against his family members. The district court granted a temporary restraining order while considering arguments from First Amendment advocates about public interest in materials that had already been entered as court evidence versus the victim rights considerations raised by the governor's legal team. This case presents unique tensions between several competing interests, explained legal analyst Sophia Washington during a cable news discussion of the publication controversy. On one hand, materials entered as evidence in a criminal trial typically become part of the public record. On the other hand, we have victim rights considerations and the extraordinary circumstance of a parent trying to prevent his child from profiting from the murder of his wife and other child. The legal questions raised complex issues about victim impact, First Amendment protections, and the ethical implications of publishing materials created by violent offenders, particularly juveniles, regardless of the analytical framework that might accompany them. Judge Maurice Reynolds, assigned to hear arguments on the injunction, acknowledged these tensions in his preliminary statements, noting the absence of clear precedent for a case with this particular constellation of family relationships and public interest considerations. As the legal battle over publication unfolded in civil court, staff at the juvenile detention facility documented a notable shift in Erica's behavior, the first significant change since her arrival following sentencing. Subject has demonstrated increased engagement with approved educational programs following correspondence about potential publication of her writings, noted Education Coordinator Lisa Chen in her monthly report. Particular focus on creative writing classes and journalism modules suggests continued interest in narrative construction and public presentation. This behavioral change reinforced assessments about Erica's primary motivations, with Dr. Walker observing in her case notes that the possibility of public attention through publication appears to have activated subjects' engagement in a way that therapeutic interventions and standard educational offerings have not achieved, supporting previous conclusions about notoriety seeking as a core motivational factor. The civil court ultimately granted Governor Harney's request for a permanent injunction against publication of Erica's journals during her incarceration, with Judge Reynolds citing the unique harm that would result from allowing the defendant to potentially profit from and gain attention through materials documenting the planning of violence against family members. This ruling established a limited but significant precedent regarding publications by juvenile offenders in cases involving family victims, particularly when a surviving parent opposed such publication. First Amendment advocates expressed concern about the implications for public access to court evidence, while victims' rights organizations praised the decision as appropriately balancing free speech considerations against the potential harm of allowing perpetrators to achieve notoriety through documentation of their crimes. 1 year after the sentencing, as Erica continued serving her term in juvenile detention while approaching her 17th birthday, the professionals who had been involved in her case participated in a closed educational symposium for law enforcement, mental health providers, and educators focused on early identification of concerning behaviors in adolescents. Detective Thompson, Prosecutor Martinez, and Dr. Montgomery presented alongside education experts and juvenile justice specialists, using the Harney case as a framework for discussing warning signs, intervention opportunities, and the challenges of distinguishing between typical adolescent interest in disturbing material and genuine risk indicators. The goal is not to create panic or excessive monitoring of normal teenage behavior, Martinez emphasized during the panel discussion, but to identify the constellation of factors that, taken together, might suggest need for closer assessment and potential intervention before violence occurs. The symposium represented one constructive outcome from a case that had devastated a family, shocked a community, and challenged assumptions about adolescent development and criminal responsibility. While no single educational initiative could prevent all similar tragedies, the professionals who had witnessed firsthand the calculated nature of Erica's crimes and the missed opportunities for intervention were determined to create something positive from their experience. A framework for better understanding the complex intersection of adolescent development, psychological factors, and potential violence that might help identify future risks before they escalated to irreversible harm. Governor Harney, though not directly participating in the symposium, provided a written statement supporting its educational mission. If sharing what we have learned from this tragedy helps even one family avoid similar devastation, then some meaning will have been created from circumstances that otherwise defy understanding. As this first year of Erica's minimum 50-year sentence concluded, the case that had begun with a chilling encounter on Pine Ridge Trail had established legal precedent regarding juvenile sentencing in cases of extreme premeditation, generated ongoing psychological research into adolescent manifestations of psychopathic traits, and created ripple effects through families, communities, and systems far beyond the immediate participants. The underlying questions raised by her crimes about the development of empathy, the recognition of warning signs, and the balance between rehabilitation and public safety in juvenile justice remain subjects of ongoing research and debate, with no simple answers emerging from a case that had tested the boundaries of conventional understanding about adolescent violence and its causes. The morning of Erica Harney's 18th birthday dawned with a procedural significance that had been established 3 years earlier at her sentencing. This was the day she would be transferred from the juvenile detention facility, where she had served the initial portion of her sentence, to the adult correctional system, where she would remain for at least the next 47 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. The transfer process had been planned for months, with staff from both facilities coordinating the logistical, security, and psychological aspects of moving a high-profile inmate whose case continued to generate occasional media interest despite the passage of time since the trial and sentencing. Dr. Meredith Walker completed her final assessment report for the juvenile system, documenting Erica's adjustment during her nearly 3 years in detention and providing recommendations for her ongoing treatment in the adult facility based on observed patterns and responses to various intervention approaches. Subject has maintained exceptional behavioral compliance throughout her juvenile detention period, Dr. Walker noted in her transfer summary, with 0 disciplinary incidents and consistent participation in required educational and treatment programs. This surface-level compliance, however, was accompanied by psychological assessments suggesting limited progress in core areas related to empathy development, genuine remorse, or recognition of the human impact of her actions. While intellectual engagement with treatment concepts has been high, the report continued, emotional processing remains significantly limited, with continued evidence of performance behavior rather than authentic engagement. Essentially, demonstration of concepts she recognizes are expected without accompanying internalization of their meaning. This assessment aligned with predictions made during trial testimony about the challenges of traditional rehabilitation approaches, given Erica's psychological profile, while acknowledging her intelligence and apparent desire for positive evaluation that had made her a compliant, if not genuinely engaged participant in juvenile programming. The adult facility receiving Erica had prepared for her arrival with specialized protocols developed in consultation with experts in managing young adult offenders with similar psychological profiles. The classification committee had designated her for placement in a specialized unit that balanced security requirements with age-appropriate programming, recognizing that despite the severity of her crimes and adult status, her developmental needs differed from those of older inmates with decades of incarceration behind them. Transfer Plan emphasizes continued education and skill development while maintaining appropriate security classification, noted the receiving facility's intake documentation, outlining a structured progression of privileges and responsibilities based on behavioral compliance rather than measures of emotional growth that might be inappropriate given her psychological assessment. On the morning of the transfer, Erica packed the limited personal belongings allowed under corrections regulations, primarily educational materials, approved correspondence, and the few personal items permitted in detention. Staff who had worked with her since her arrival noted the same composed demeanor that had characterized her courtroom appearances, with juvenile counselor James Martinez observing in his final contact note that resident displayed no apparent anxiety about transfer despite significant change in circumstances, maintaining the same controlled affect observed throughout her detention period. This emotional regulation, initially identified during trial as evidence of calculation rather than adolescent impulsivity, had remained consistent throughout her juvenile incarceration, with staff documentation repeatedly noting her unusual composure compared to typical juvenile detainees facing similar long-term consequences. The transport team arrived mid-morning following established protocols for high-profile transfers that minimized both public attention and security risks. Erica was escorted to the transport vehicle without incident, her expression neutral as she nodded acknowledgement to staff she had interacted with over the previous years. Subject asked once about media presence at either facility, noted Transport Officer Rebecca Chen in her procedural report, but otherwise made no inquiries about transfer logistics or destination specifics. This continued interest in public attention, however subtle, aligned with the psychological assessments that had identified notoriety-seeking as a primary motivational factor in her original crimes, an orientation that appeared largely unchanged despite 3 years of incarceration and therapeutic intervention. At the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility in Denver, intake staff processed Erica according to standard procedures while accounting for her unique status as an 18-year-old transferring from juvenile detention with a minimum 50-year sentence ahead of her. Psychological Services Director Dr. Nathan Reed conducted an initial evaluation to establish baseline observations and review the extensive case file transferred from the juvenile system. New arrival demonstrates sophisticated awareness of institutional expectations, he noted in his intake assessment, with presentation suggesting prior preparation for adult facility protocols rather than typical adjustment anxiety observed in new commitments. This observation aligned with juvenile records indicating Erica had extensively researched adult corrections procedures through approved educational materials, approaching the transition with the same methodical information gathering that had characterized her planning before the murders. Governor Declan Harney, now in the final year of his second term and having announced he would not seek other political office after leaving the governorship, received notification of his daughter's transfer as required by victim notification protocols established during sentencing. His chief of staff confirmed receipt of the information without additional comment, maintaining the governor's long-established practice of handling all matters related to his daughter's case privately rather than through public statements. Political observers had noted how the tragedy had fundamentally altered Harney's governance approach and public persona, with policy priorities shifting toward mental health resources, family support systems, and early intervention programs, while his previously engaging personal style had been replaced by a more reserved, policy-focused public presence that rarely referenced his personal life. As Erica began the adjustment to adult incarceration, the broader impacts of her case continued to reverberate through various systems and institutions. The educational symposium that had begun as a one-time event following her sentencing had evolved into an annual training program for school counselors, resource officers, and mental health providers focused on early identification of concerning behaviors in adolescents. Detective Daniel Thompson, though now retired from active law enforcement, continued to participate as a presenter, sharing insights from the investigation that had revealed extensive planning and research preceding the murders. "We're not looking to create panic about typical teenage interest in disturbing material," he emphasized during the fourth annual training, "but to help professionals recognize patterns and constellations of behaviors that, taken together, might warrant further assessment and potential intervention." The legal precedents established in Erica's case regarding juvenile sentencing in situations of extreme premeditation had influenced subsequent cases throughout Colorado and been cited in appellate decisions in several other states. Legal scholar Professor Amanda Winters published a comprehensive analysis in the Colorado Law Review, examining how Judge Harney's sentencing decision had navigated the tension between Supreme Court precedents requiring consideration of juvenile status and the extraordinary evidence of calculation that had characterized Erica's crimes. The Harney case established an important framework for distinguishing between typical adolescent impulsivity and the kind of extended, methodical planning that may justify more substantial consequences even for juvenile offenders, Winters wrote, noting how subsequent cases had referenced this distinction when determining appropriate sentences for serious crimes committed by minors. 3 years after sentencing, the civil litigation regarding publication of Erica's journals had finally concluded with the Colorado Supreme Court, upholding the permanent injunction against publication during her incarceration, establishing a limited but significant precedent regarding the balance between First Amendment considerations and victim impact in cases involving family members. The court's ruling recognizes the unique harm that would result from allowing publication of materials documenting the planning of violence against family members when opposed by surviving victims, explained legal analyst Marcus Chen during a public radio discussion of the decision. While limited to these specific circumstances, it establishes an important principle about the limits of a convicted offender's right to publicize their crimes when doing so would create additional harm to victims. Pine Ridge Trail in Aspen, which had been temporarily closed following the murders, had reopened after 6 months, but remained altered in subtle ways by the tragedy that had occurred there. Local hikers reported avoiding the specific clearing where the bodies had been discovered, creating an unofficial detour that eventually became marked by natural usage patterns despite not appearing on official trail maps. The Aspen Parks Department had deliberately chosen not to place any marker or memorial at the site, following consultation with trauma experts who advised against creating a location that might attract morbid curiosity or dark tourism rather than genuine remembrance. Instead, community healing had centered around the Memorial Garden at Aspen Regional High School, which had become a quiet space for reflection, not only about Jennifer and Laurel Harney, but about other community losses as well. At the adult correctional facility, Erica quickly established patterns that both paralleled and evolved from her behavior in juvenile detention. Educational staff noted her immediate enrollment in available college-level correspondence courses with particular focus on psychology, criminology, and legal studies, subjects that aligned with her long-standing interests while potentially providing practical knowledge relevant to her circumstances. New commitment demonstrates exceptional academic motivation compared to typical population, observed Education Coordinator Melissa Rivera in her quarterly report, completing assignments well ahead of deadlines and requesting additional materials beyond course requirements. This intellectual engagement, while positive from an educational perspective, was noted by psychological services as potentially representing continued interest in the same subjects that had occupied her research before the murders, rather than indicating therapeutic progress or changed orientation. Dr. Reed's ongoing psychological assessments documented Erica's adjustment to the adult system with particular attention to her interactions with other inmates and staff. Subject demonstrates strategic social engagement, he noted 6 months after her transfer, forming connections primarily with staff members and inmates who provide practical advantages rather than emotional support, suggesting continued instrumental rather than effective orientation to relationships. This pattern aligned with assessments from the juvenile system about Erica's tendency to view others primarily in terms of their utility rather than as emotional connections, a core characteristic of the psychological profile identified during trial that appeared largely unchanged by 3 years of incarceration and intervention programs. The most notable development in Erica's first year in adult corrections came through her participation in a supervised peer education program, where her academic abilities and composed presentation made her an effective tutor for inmates working toward GED completion or basic literacy goals. Program coordinator Jasmine Washington initially expressed reservations about Erica's participation given her case history, but eventually recommended her continuation based on consistently positive feedback from participants and staff observations of appropriate boundaries and interactions. While motivations may remain primarily self-interested, Washington noted in her evaluation, the practical outcome benefits multiple inmates working toward educational goals that support rehabilitation and eventual reintegration. This pragmatic approach reflected the facility's overall strategy with Erica, focusing on constructive behaviors and positive contributions regardless of underlying motivations, recognizing that behavioral change might be a more realistic goal than fundamental psychological transformation given her profile. On the 3rd anniversary of the sentencing, several national media outlets published retrospective analyses of the case that had briefly captured public attention before being displaced by newer tragedies and controversies. These pieces generally focused on the psychological and legal aspects that had made the case particularly disturbing. The extensive premeditation by a 15-year-old, the calculation evident in her research and planning, and the apparent motivation of notoriety that had been established through digital evidence and her own writings. True crime author Vanessa Mitchell, who had followed the case from its beginning, published a comprehensive book examining the investigation, trial, and subsequent developments with particular attention to the psychological assessments that had attempted to explain how a teenager with no prior criminal history had methodically planned and executed the murder of her family members. The most disturbing aspect of this case remains its resistance to simple explanation, Mitchell wrote in her conclusion, after hundreds of pages documenting the evidence and expert opinions presented during trial. We understand the mechanisms of what happened, the planning, the research, the execution of violence, the careful staging of evidence, but the fundamental why continues to elude even those with the most extensive access to Erica Harney's writings, statements, and psychological evaluations. This absence of a satisfying explanatory narrative that might help make sense of the senseless had contributed to the case's lasting impact on those directly involved, and its continued reference in discussions of juvenile violence, family annihilation, and the limitations of current frameworks for understanding the development of extreme violence in otherwise apparently ordinary adolescents. 4 years after the murders, as Erica approached her 19th birthday in adult incarceration, Governor Harney prepared to leave office following the completion of his second term. His farewell address to the state legislature made no direct reference to his personal tragedy, but included passages that those familiar with his story recognized as deeply informed by his experience. Our most important work lies not in the policies we enact, but in the systems of support we build for families facing challenges beyond their individual capacity to overcome, he told the assembled legislators. The strength of our communities depends not on how we celebrate our successes, but on how we respond when darkness touches the lives of our neighbors, our friends, and sometimes our own families. This oblique acknowledgement of his personal journey represented the closest Harney had come to publicly addressing the impact of his daughter's crimes on his life and governance philosophy. Following his departure from office, Harney established a private foundation dedicated to advancing research and programming in adolescent mental health, early intervention for concerning behaviors, and support for families affected by violent crime. The Jennifer and Laurel Harney Foundation, named for his murdered wife and younger daughter rather than focusing on the criminal case that had taken them, quickly established itself as a respected funding source for evidence-based programs addressing the complex factors that can lead to youth violence. Our mission grows from loss but focuses on prevention and healing, stated the Foundation's mission document, outlining a vision that acknowledged the complicated reality that most violent offenders, including juveniles, had themselves experienced trauma, psychological challenges, or systemic failures before engaging in harmful behaviors. The Foundation's work represented Harney's attempt to create meaning from circumstances that otherwise defied understanding, a constructive response to tragedy that focused on preventing similar situations for other families while supporting those already affected by violence. Though he never served as the Foundation's public face, preferring to work behind the scenes while professional staff managed programs and communications, his personal experience informed every aspect of its approach, from research funding priorities to direct service programs for families navigating the aftermath of violence. This work allowed him to honor the memory of his wife and younger daughter while acknowledging the complex reality that his surviving child, despite her calculated violence and apparent lack of remorse, remained connected to him through bonds of family that even the most heinous actions could not fully sever. At the correctional facility, Erica continued her pattern of exceptional behavioral compliance alongside limited emotional or psychological growth, maintaining the same composed demeanor that had characterized her presentation since arrest, while advancing through available educational and vocational programs. Subject demonstrates intellectual engagement without corresponding emotional development, noted Dr. Reed in his annual assessment as Erica approached 4 years of incarceration. Cognitive understanding of concepts related to empathy, remorse, and human impact remains high, while affective integration of these concepts shows minimal progress. This assessment aligned with predictions made during trial testimony about the likely trajectory of Erica's response to incarceration and intervention, suggesting that while behavioral management and structured programming could create constructive channels for her intelligence and self-interest, fundamental psychological change remained an uncertain and potentially unattainable goal given her profile. As Erica settled into the long-term reality of her incarceration, with at least 46 more years before parole eligibility, the case that had begun with a chilling encounter on Pine Ridge Trail had become part of the complex tapestry of criminal justice history, psychological research, and human tragedy that informs societal understanding of extreme violence. The calculated nature of her crimes, the extensive evidence of premeditation by a 15-year-old, and the apparent motivation of notoriety continued to challenge conventional frameworks for understanding juvenile offending, while the legal precedents established in her case influenced ongoing discussions about appropriate responses to serious crimes committed by minors regardless of their sophistication or planning. For those directly affected, the father who had lost his wife and younger daughter to violence committed by his older child, the extended family members grappling with layers of grief and confusion, the professionals who had investigated, prosecuted, defended, and treated a teenager whose actions defied easy explanation, the impact remained deeply personal, despite the case's broader implications. Their individual journeys of processing, healing, and finding meaning demonstrated the ripple effects of violence that extend far beyond statistical accounts of crime and punishment, creating personal and professional transformations that continue long after legal proceedings conclude, and public attention shifts elsewhere. In the end, the case of Erica Harney raised more questions than it answered about the development of violence in youth, the recognition of warning signs, and the balance between rehabilitation and public safety in juvenile justice. The extensive documentation of her planning, research, and apparent motivation provided a disturbing window into processes that usually remain hidden. While her continued psychological presentation during incarceration suggested that some patterns may be more resistant to change than conventional rehabilitation models anticipate. These uncomfortable realities, alongside the human tragedy experienced by all involved, ensured that the case would remain a reference point in ongoing efforts to better understand, prevent, and respond to serious violence committed by juveniles. A legacy far different from the notoriety Erica had apparently sought, but perhaps more lasting in its influence on systems and approaches designed to prevent similar tragedies in the future.